The main character was the best in the online game Lost World. In this game, players played the roles of gods of different races, and then they developed them and fought with other players. Throughout the game, he was able to earn most of the possible achievements. And now I played without interest against a player nicknamed Hegemony. Hegemony was ranked second and was no mean opponent. For a long time, both opponents fought small battles and accumulated strength and experience. At some point, the main character, Sung-Woon, decided to use a nuclear warhead attack, and the Hegemony responded by activating interceptor missiles and shooting down all the warheads. Then Sung-Woon activated another nuclear warhead without delay. Now his opponent had no technical protection and it could work. If at that moment the orcs, together with their emperor, had not fallen to their knees, and they did not offer prayers to the orc god, this prayer activated the spirit of the apostle, which resembled the silhouette of a bipedal creature of enormous size. With his ghostly hand, he easily caught the warhead, stopping it from falling. If this were in the real world, prayers would not save anyone. But in this game, prayers and faith were much stronger than technology, because the gods controlled the entire territory of the earth along with the sky, and against them there was no weapon in heaven or on earth. Therefore, Hegemony used the Holy Oak tactic, believing that it was invincible. He chose heaven as his kingdom and secretly accumulated faith instead of skills, to protect oneself from technology by invoking the spirit of the apostle. It was an obvious move. He simply took into account Sung-Woon's strategy of developing technology, but he didn't take into account that the sky didn't end with the Earth's atmosphere. Space was free from the influence of the gods, and there was Sung-Woon's military satellite. There was nothing on it except a few tungsten rods, but even they were enough, so he activated a mass strike. Hegemony tried to use the spirit to stop the rods, but the speed at which the rods fell was too high. They pierced the spirit and continued to fall. When the rods reached the ground, they caused huge explosions and destroyed everything. Having destroyed the imperial palace, the rods also reached the underground temple. Thus, the emperor of the Hegemony found himself buried under one of the rods. The underground temple contained the main reserves of faith, and they were all destroyed. But the faith that remained was not enough, so it quickly began to evaporate. And when this happened, the giant apostles also began to disappear. Thus, Sung-Woon emerged victorious from the fight again. But the Hegemony was not happy with this development of events and demanded revenge. Sung-Woon agreed to a rematch, hoping for something new. But the Hegemony used the same tactics again and lost again. And the game board reported on all the achievements completed. The guy was already thinking about leaving the game when suddenly he received a notification. There, in addition to congratulations, it was reported that the official release of the game would soon be, and he was given access to a private screening before the release. The next notification asked if he wanted to start the game. Sung-Woon couldn't refuse such an offer and clicked on the yes button. At that very moment, he seemed to lose consciousness and fell asleep, and when he opened his eyes again, he was surprised to notice other locations around him. The columns that were around resembled the ruins of an old Greek temple. Everything seemed so unreal that it seemed like a dream. Hearing his guess refuted, Sung-Woon turned towards the voice. It was a man in strange clothing who announced that Sung-Woon had been chosen. The man also gave his real name, which he did not enter in the game. All this was strange, and even stranger were the words about the Chosen One. Besides this, there were some shadows to the side of the guy. It looked like all these shadows were people too, but it was not clear who they were. And the man said that they hide their faces so that the game is fair. After that, he raised his hands and pointed to the planet above their heads. In appearance, this planet was very similar to Earth. But in fact, this was the lost world that was so familiar to them all. And there they all had to become gods themselves. The shadows began to move. Everyone was confused. They were told that the lost world was not a game, but was the reality of the planet. Once upon a time, there were a large number of races and civilization flourished there. Thanks to the development of science, everyone lived in peace and harmony. But at some point, the gods left this world for some unknown reason. That's when the game was created to select worthy candidates for their role. Now everyone who wanted to had to fight each other for real. The rules and tactics were the same as in the game, and only one winner in the end can become a true god. Moreover, if one player killed another, he died for real. Those who wanted to leave could give up only at the start, and they were not in any danger. But once the game started, there was no turning back. After hearing everything, Sung-Woon only became more determined to play. But some people began to give up, not wanting to risk their lives. So, out of the 32 players who were there at the beginning, there are 27 left. After that, no one spoke about surrender anymore. As in the game, everyone was given the opportunity to choose one of the minor races. This could be done by choosing one of the cards on the altar in front of them. The queue was based on the ranking list, so Sung-Woon was first. The order of the cards didn't matter, so he took a random card. But as soon as he turned it over, his expression changed to one of surprise. At that moment, his body shimmered and he went to the lost world. He was given a race of insects that were the weakest in every sense. But it was no longer possible to give up, and it remained to find a use for them. The main problem was that they had an unfavorable habitat on the edge of the continent. This place was not rich in resources with which one could level up, but there were many monsters from different races, and those who ate insects could be used. Since he only had 10 faith points, he had to choose his starting race wisely. The frogs ate the insects, but there were too many tribes, and the starting 10 points of faith were not enough to make them do anything. So Song-Woon continued to look for other options, and he noticed a group of humanoid lizards in the desert. They also fed on insects and could do without water. This group consisted of the weak and old who separated from the main group, but their small numbers played into Song-Woon's hands, as they paid more attention to the miracles. One of the lizards particularly caught his attention. His physical and mental condition was on the brink. It was easiest for such people to believe in God having received only a small miracle. That's why Song-Woon chose him as his target to start with. The lizards continued moving through the desert until they spotted an antelope. The antelope was wounded and could not move. The strongest of the group rushed towards her and quickly finished her off, after which they began to devour the meat at great speed. The old people and the wounded who were left behind immediately accepted that they would not get any food. After some time, only bones remained from the antelope. The healthy lizards wanted to eat them too, but the commander did not allow them to do this. And having collected all the bones, he gave them to those who could not hunt and did not eat. And they in turn began to slowly absorb them. They cared for everyone and had no intention of abandoning the old and weak. But some doubted whether it was worth feeding the wounded in vain. His wound had already begun to rot, which indicated that he would soon die. This lizard, Rak, was the only one who fought the saber-toothed tiger and protected his relatives. Everyone respected this, but they also understood that food was more needed by the living. As night fell, the lizards huddled together and fell asleep. But suddenly Rak was awakened by the bright blue light of a butterfly flying in. He stood up and looked at the small hill, which was also shimmering with a bright light. The butterfly flew there, and Rak followed her. The beastmen noticed him climbing the hill. Some assumed that he had decided to leave them and continued to watch. The wounded lizard continued to follow the butterfly. It sounded like nonsense, but he hoped there was something there. He finally reached the top and found a swarm of beetles there. Song-Woon immediately received a message that a miracle had been discovered. The beetles he sent would have been enough for the group for several days. In the meantime, he was going to develop a plan, but he didn't have to worry about the group finding out about him. Rak himself happily told them about him and his miracle. After this, the system informed Song-Woon of his new title as the God of Bugs. Although he had hoped for a more beautiful name, it did not upset him. In the end, a great name didn't matter at the beginning of the game. The lizard Rak became very important to his plans, and he was going to do his best to help and support him. Thanks to good nutrition, after some time, Rak's wound began to heal. The group continued moving, and every now and then he would have new visions. Everyone already knew that this meant a large number of beetles, but the beetles appeared only from the north side, as if the group was being led there specifically. At some point, they had to stop and think whether it was worth going there. The lizards were warm-blooded and could not stand the cold. It seemed as if they were being led to their death and should turn back. But that wasn't an option either. There was only bare desert behind us. Song-Woon watched all this, unable to do anything to help. The lizard's faith was still low and many functions were blocked. Rak and the other lizards continued to follow the butterfly until we reached an oasis hidden behind the hills. Then Rak announced to the others that God had led them to refuge. And everyone joyfully began to offer prayers of gratitude to the god of beetles. Because of this, both the divinity and the level of the small race of Song-Woon increased. Now he could bestow the blessing. With its help, believers could develop and get rid of their weaknesses. But Song-Woon put it off until later, while he still had little faith. So he first made Rak his priest so that he would convey his will to others. So Song-Woon could give him hints through dreams and spend less faith. That same night he came to the lizard for the first time in his dream. In order not to frighten him with his appearance, he took the form of a lizard and hid his face. And then he extended his hand to Rak, offering to take it. Before Rak could even come to his senses, he found himself with a buffalo skull in his hands. Giant horns protruded from the head, and the skull itself was in good condition. After examining it, he handed the skull to the lizard man standing in front of him. He in turn put the skull on his head and lowered his arms to his sides. Then it became clear to Rak that the god of beetles himself stood before him. The next morning, he told his fellow tribesmen about his dream. Everyone was sure that God wanted to receive a buffalo as a sacrifice. But hunting in the desert was too dangerous for the whole group. Zayol, the original head of the group, was categorically against this, so Rak decided to catch the buffalo himself. To prove this, he took a spear, which was a sharp stone blade tied to a shaft. The rest of the group, led by Zayol, tried to dissuade him from doing so, But they calmed down when they heard that God had given him a blessing. His words were confirmed by the fact that the wounds on his shoulder had healed. And besides this, it was covered with black scales just like those of beetles. But Zael still wasn't sure if she should let him go alone. Then he decided to demonstrate his strength and swung his spear and threw it at the tree. With a roar, the spear pierced a dry old tree, which immediately split into pieces. At the sight of such power, the entire group except Zael burst into joyful cries. And Rakrak, in turn, without a word, approached the tree and took his spear. The rest of the group caught up with him, still amazed at his strength. Suddenly, sounds were heard from the foot of the hill. Something was approaching the oasis. It was a herd of buffalo, the very ones that were to be sacrificed. It was strange that a herd of buffalo, which always moved to the same place, came there. Everything indicated that the bug god had a hand in this. So Rakrak decided not to think about it, but to start hunting as soon as possible. And without listening to objections, he rushed forward first. And then with great speed, he attacked one of the buffaloes with a spear. The spear pierced the buffalo's head and he fell dead. The rest of the hunters followed Rakrak and joined the hunt. In the evening, after eating, they assembled the altar for the sacrifice. It consisted of buffalo bones and heads, and a live buffalo was suspended above it. Once the preparations were complete, Rakrak began the ritual. He knelt down and began to pray for the god to accept their offering. The rest of the clan also bowed before the altar and joined in the prayer. Although the ritual was performed poorly, it still had an effect, and brought even more faith points than Song Woon expected. It was difficult for him to drive the buffaloes to the oasis because he was not a god of grass, so he had to use locusts to help build the path. But the results were worth the effort. However, the lizards were not at all trained to live in one place. They didn't know how to run a farm or raise livestock, and this could lead to the fact that when the oasis's resources are exhausted, they will die. Song Woon couldn't give them the knowledge directly. That would break the rules of the game. So he began with blessings and began to bless all who followed his priest. Several years have passed since then. The blessings have made the lizards stronger and more resilient. Along with them, the altar grew. Now it looked like a majestic mountain of bones and skulls. But Rakrak was troubled by the dream he had. In his dream, the altar shook dangerously, and all the resources that were in the oasis disappeared. Until that happened, there was nothing to worry about, according to Zael. But it seemed like God was trying to warn them about something. So Rakrak tried to understand the meaning of the dream he had. Sitting on the altar, he looked at the horizon, still thinking, until he suddenly noticed something in the distance and immediately jumped to his feet. And then Zael helped me up there and excitedly pointed at something. It was some kind of group. They were moving slowly, and there were too many of them for the buffalo. But now Rakrak understood why the altar was shaking and what the god was trying to warn about. Long-faced, bipedal, scaly-faced, these were the ones who had driven them out of the tribe in the past. Rakrak easily recognized their commander, Bor. He remained the same as before. But besides being huge himself, he also rode a manun. This creature, although not a dragon, was also considered powerful. Their tribe moved through the desert and seemed to have been on the road for a long time, apparently because the previous habitat has been completely depleted. No one knew whether this was because God had taken away the fertile lands or for some other reason. Zael still had hope that the tribe might simply pass by. But this was not destined to come true because they were betrayed by scouts. They stopped Commander Bor and forbade the tribe to go further. Rakrak immediately saw God's plan in what happened. Although Zael considered it a test, he saw it more as a mission. And this mission for him consisted of saving and accepting his former fellow tribesmen. The only problem with his plan was Bor, who had nothing spiritual about him. But the butterfly that appeared in front of Rakrak indicated that he was on the right path. Convinced of his guess, he promised God to do everything possible. Songwoon really wanted the two tribes to unite. This was necessary for the growth of the number of believers and their development. And his priest was able to make such a decision himself only thanks to willpower. Although in reality the emergence of another tribe was only indirectly the work of Songwon, the locusts he used ate all the grass in those areas, so the animals left. High willpower meant that the character could do things on her own, and she was disliked for that. But its presence did not always mean that the character would act differently than the player intended. It was enough to impose a strong faith on the character. And Seong-woon was going to strengthen Rakrak's faith as much as possible so that the plan would work. While he was watching from above, Rakrak, along with his assistant and friends, reached Bor. He told the other lizards about the god and that this place belonged to him. But Bor didn't care about his words and began to threaten violence so that they would be allowed to pass. He believed that their numbers would be sufficient to deal with the other group. But Rakrak did not respond to the threats, although he pointed a spear towards Bor. Instead, he called on the tribe to follow their bug god. No one answered his call, and the commander only laughed. After that, they exchanged a few more words. But talking about God only angered Bor, and he started the fight by kicking Manun in the back. Manon's eyes flashed brightly and he rushed into the attack with great speed. Rakrak could only try to block the attack and pray to God, but his spear was quickly broken in two by the powerful paws of the Manhwa. Now Song-Woon watched in slow motion as Manhwa attacked the defenseless lizard. For a while he didn't think this fight was really important, but just at that moment the number of points increased, and the system unlocked a new divine control ability, which Sun-Woon immediately decided to test and take control of Rakrak. The moment the Manhwa struck, a bright light blinded everyone on the battlefield. The glow disappeared as soon as Song-Woon gained full control over his body, and then he hurried to jump away from the Manhwa. And taking advantage of the pause, he examined his new body, which seemed alien and unusual. Boar sent the Manhwa into attack again, believing that the enemy was simply lucky. But the lizard wasn't the main problem. Rakrak could deal with it himself. The only problem was the Manhwa, which was too strong for one lizard. But not for a god whose skills gave him an extra few hundred units of power. Therefore, Song-Woon attacked first without delay, and grabbing the Manhwa by the upper jaw, he easily turned him over onto his back. Such power made everyone who was there freeze. But Rakrak's friends quickly came to their senses and began to praise him. But the look he gave them made them immediately fall silent. Now it seemed the fight was over, but Boar did not agree with this outcome, and he tried to attack Song-Woon with a knife, but he was faster and broke Boar's neck as soon as he got close. There was a brief silence among the Lizardman tribe, and then they threw down their weapons and bowed, swearing allegiance. Now the battle was definitely over, and the god left Rakrak's body. It was as if he had woken up from a dream, not remembering anything that had happened. Now both parts of the tribe have united, and there are 6 times more of them than there were before. The oasis and its resources became catastrophically insufficient. This made Rakrak think about what they should do in the future. They could not stay there and had to go into the wasteland again. He knew that the answer to all his questions was somewhere in those lands. God gave him this clue when he led the rest of the tribe to the oasis. The next day, the Manhwa, who was caught and tied to a tree, went on a rampage. Several lizards tried to calm him down, but they failed. Manhwa stopped struggling only when Rakrak arrived. He remembered how he had been slammed to the ground, and he didn't want to feel that again. However, the lizard did not come with evil intentions and only wanted to feed him. Not immediately, but the Manhwa allowed him to do this and ate the food from his hands, after which he even melted towards him and allowed himself to be petted without any problems. They couldn't kill him because God left him alive and must have had a plan. When the Manhwa had eaten his fill, he became calmer and friendlier. So Rakrak left him, leaving guards to keep an eye on him just in case. Next, Rakrak met a lizard who could make weapons out of metal. During the conversation, it became clear that Boar had forbidden them to burn trees. For a good fire, a special fuel was needed, charcoal. They could only get it from a large number of burnt trees. That's why I couldn't create more weapons before, but I could do it now that the command had changed. Rakrak promised to think about it until the next day and sent the Blade Master away. Next, a one-armed lizard came to him different from the others. He offered his services as a guide because he knew the wastelands well. In addition, during his travels, he learned to find his way by the stars. And he had experience and knowledge of safe places where the group could find food. But despite this, I didn't know for sure whether these places were taken or still free. But Rakrak quickly decided that even if the lands were occupied, they would conquer them. This convinced the one-armed lizard that he could trust him. But Rakrak himself was not sure about the one-armed man who had once been part of another group. The one-armed lizard paused to think and look at the sky, and then he pointed to it and promised that the answer was there and was in the stars. As darkness fell, they finally appeared in the sky. The whole point was that they were on the move. The one-armed man knew which paths they were taking, and thanks to them he never got lost on the road. To prove his loyalty, he told Rakrak more about the star paths. All his words could be confirmed only after several days of observation. So, having finished his story, the one-armed lizard left, and in his place came the excited Ur. He reminded them that they needed a way to cross the wilderness without losses, and when he saw that the Manhwa became kinder after feeding, an idea came to his mind. They could try to do the same with other animals and thus subjugate them. He didn't know if it would work, but they could try starting with the buffalo that were grazing nearby. Thus, the Rakraka tribe independently discovered the skill of cattle breeding. In the Lost World, humanity evolved along one of 2 branches. It was either agriculture or livestock breeding. These rules were mentioned in the game itself, and no one went against them. And agriculture was distinguished by stability. Many civilizations began with it. But since Song-Woon had chosen the Lizardmen tribe, he couldn't resort to it. Considering their lifestyle, cattle breeding was the most suitable option for them. And besides this tribe learned to process ore. The master showed the others how to make coal and heat metal. Eventually, they even learned to give it the desired shape. Although metal weapons were heavier than stone ones, they were also more powerful. For tribes that had long had to fight with stones, this was a step forward. Besides this, they also learned about astronomy. Although they still lacked knowledge, this was not the limit of their development, and in the distant future all this knowledge could be used correctly. Several days have passed since then, and at one point Rakrak gathered the entire tribe at the altar and began his speech. He reminded the others of all the good things God had done for them, and that he allowed them to reunite with each other. All this was good for them, and now they had to accept another of his wills. And at dawn leave the oasis to go into the wasteland in search of a new home. A one-armed lizard with turquoise skin approached Rakrak, who announced him as their guide. There was no longer any doubt in the one-armed man's words, and Rakrak himself was convinced of this. With the onset of morning under his leadership, they were to pass to the right of the place of his sunrise. The journey along this road could take 10 days before they turned to the Rotten River. Turning right, they had to walk for another 15 days to reach the mountain rift. The crossing could take 3 days, and only after that would their final destination await them. The goal was an endless forest, with many wild animals and tribes of other creatures. As soon as the one-armed man finished his speech, he hurried back into the crowd. After this, there was silence. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. Then Rakrak climbed onto the altar and addressed one of the warriors named Ur. He wanted to know what reason he had for obeying the order not to eat buffalo. Ur hesitated and thought for a moment, trying to answer correctly. In the end, the only reason he didn't do it was because he wasn't hungry. So he and the others did not eat the buffaloes, but left them for later. This was exactly the answer Rakrak was expecting, and it was the right answer. So he made Ur a promise that he would follow this rule, and after that he decided to reward them for their patience and give them an iron spear. It was a pre-arranged event, and the blacksmith had prepared a sufficient quantity. It was obvious that the warriors needed better equipment, and it was going to be distributed anyway. Rakrak simply added more pomp and drama to the event. But the distribution of spears was not the end of it. The warriors still had to undergo an initiation ceremony. First, he took one of the buffalo skulls from the altar and placed it on his head, and then, calling the warriors one by one, he did the same with them. Now they were called Bone Warriors and served the god of beetles. The meeting lasted all night. No one slept until sunrise. As soon as the first rays of light appeared, Rakrak announced that the time had come for them to leave this place. They didn't need to worry about the abandoned altar. God existed without it. But since many of the lizards were still hesitant, he gave a motivational speech, which had the desired effect and cheered everyone up, and he managed to convince everyone else that their journey was the will of God. But since this was not true, after finishing his speech, he quietly asked God for forgiveness. Song Woon didn't hold a grudge against him because he himself gave him the freedom to act independently. Moreover, he expected something like this, and if Rakrak had acted differently, he would not have been his priest. Under his command, his allies achieved good results, and his special skills, which were not visible before, finally appeared. He lived up to the expectations placed on him and was able to make a new beginning. The lizards walked through the desert for a long time without any problems, until suddenly the exhausted Manhua fell in the middle of the road. Then the tribe had no choice but to stop and rest. Rakrak could not rest. He was overcome by many disturbing thoughts about the journey. They walked at a fast pace for 3 days without stopping, and the group was very tired from this. And besides that, they were already running out of food and water. Now all they could do was hope that God would send them a miracle. Not much time passed before an excited scout appeared, and he reported that another tribe was approaching them at great speed. These were goblins who didn't even know they existed. All they wanted was to get out of the canyon as quickly as possible and get as far away as possible. There were no more obstacles in their way, and it could work. If they hadn't suddenly come across a group of lizard men ready to defend themselves. The leader of the lizards, Rakrak, tried to dissuade those who had arrived from attacking, but the goblins didn't even argue and threw down their weapons themselves. And their leader bowed and asked for forgiveness. They didn't want to hurt anyone and were just trying to get out of the canyon as quickly as possible. Rakrak assumed that the goblins simply wanted to steal their food and make a quick escape. But since they did nothing, he still shared his food with them. They had to flee the wastelands, leaving everything they had behind. Previously, they lived behind the hill, and the land there was not fertile. But at the same time, their tribe had enough of everything, and they did not starve, until a monster appeared in that place, which forced them to leave. Song Woon already guessed what kind of monster it was, but I still decided to check to confirm my guess. The monster had a hard upper body and looked like a giant centipede. This and similar creatures were once created by gods in the past, but even though their owners disappeared, these creatures remained on Earth. The goblins brought a group of lizards led by Rakrak to that place, and having ordered them to remain silent, they showed them where the sleeping centipede was. Now this centipede was too strong an opponent for the lizards. Her roar alone made the earth shake. Rakrak hesitated in his decision, not knowing what was the best course of action. The detour would have taken another 8 days. They did not have enough supplies and strength for this, but it was the safest option for everyone. Moreover, almost all of his fellow tribesmen were frightened and did not want to fight. While he was thinking, Zhao looked around the place where they were. She was the one who gave the idea that they should fight and not go around. Besides, while the centipede was sleeping in the valley, they had an advantage. They could have thrown those huge boulders that were on the rocks onto her. To achieve this, a tool was needed that would reduce effort and increase strength. Something similar to the fire bellows they were already familiar with, but simpler. So they invented levers with which they were going to push the boulders down. Several warriors stood behind each boulder and began to push them. Songwoon didn't interfere and simply watched everything from the side. He knew this plan could work. They could kill the centipede that way, but only if all the stones were thrown down at the same time. It didn't take long before the first boulders began to roll down the mountain. The sounds of falling rocks alarmed the centipede and it woke up. But she couldn't dodge the blow and the stones immediately smashed against her head. It didn't work and didn't do any damage to her. The centipede just went berserk and rushed towards the lizards. The lizards began to try harder to throw off the remaining boulders faster. But with their speed, they wouldn't be able to do it in time, so Songwoon decided to help them. As soon as he entered Rakrak's body again, he began to push boulders on his own. And as soon as he had finished with them, he grabbed a spear and rushed towards the centipede. After flying a few meters in the air, he swung and threw it with all his might. The spear flashed through the air like a beam of light, and it easily pierced the shell of the centipede, which was trying to rise back up. Despite the good damage, the blow did not kill her. This was done by the boulders which the centipede could no longer avoid. Eventually, one of these boulders crushed her head completely. As soon as this happened, Songwoon left Rakrak's body, after which he again began to observe everything from a third-person perspective. And the system immediately informed him that the hunt for the monster was successful. The amount of faith points in him increased even more after the victory. Songwoon also received a reward for hunting, which is why he killed the centipede. It was her essence that helped create a new unique entity. The entities helped spread rumors about God by their very existence, and they could develop enough to become an apostle or an avatar. That's why Songwoon was planning to create some kind of entity using her. Meanwhile, the lizards tried to figure out whether it was possible to eat centipede meat. Zale even tore off one of the legs and tried it raw. Although it smelled strongly, it didn't taste bad. Still, it was hard to eat just like that. Then she found some leaves and tried cooking the meat over a fire to get rid of the taste. And it worked. The meat stopped smelling and became softer and tastier. At some point, Zale started talking about heirs, and she suggested that Rakrak consider her as a candidate for the role of partner. However, he didn't even have time to properly think over her proposal and respond. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to some bright glow behind Zale. There was something shining brightly among the rubble of the altar. The boulder crushed the altar, but it was still clear that it was a golden tablet. Yor picked it up and tasted it, but he was unable to bite off a piece. This was because the tablet was made of gold, and the one-armed lizard knew it. Gold was a very valuable metal that was not susceptible to corrosion. But since it was soft, there was still a mark from the teeth on it. It was clear that this sign was there for a reason. Rakrak looked at it for a long time, trying to understand why someone was trying to save it. The lizards from his tribe had already managed to hunt and eat during this time, and now Zale said that they were getting ready for bed. Although he didn't tell anyone where he was, she found him by his fur cape, which was originally proposed so that it could be distinguished from the others. As night fell, Rakrak was still sitting in the same place, looking at the symbols on the tablet. The body of the deer in front of him was bleeding, already covered in flies and swarming with beetles. Suddenly, the beetles seemed to move in a certain pattern, as if they were being guided by an invisible hand. The movement of these beetles resembles an engraving that was made on a tablet. The lizard understood what this meant and began to draw the symbols from the tablet on the ground with a stick. The next morning, he returned to camp and woke Zao up to show her something. And then he showed her the first few symbols he came up with. These were symbols representing a male and female lizard. Thus, he also responded with consent to her proposal to become partners. The system immediately informed Songwoon that the Rakrak tribe had invented writing. Even though it was early in the game and things would still change, the fact that it happened so early made him happy. Now Rakrak's tribe enjoyed a festival in honor of his wedding, and they took part in a competition to catch the largest game for their partner. In the end, both lizards did an excellent job of completing their tasks. After some time, the tribe of lizards ate almost the entire centipede. Rakrak did not take away the goblins' lands and left them to live there. Even though it was he who defeated the monster, these lands still belonged to them. The goblin chieftain was grateful to him for his mercy, so he introduced me to his son and suggested that he guide the lizards to the forest. Rakrak and his tribe were unfamiliar with the area, so they did not refuse the offer. At parting, the chief promised Rakrak never to forget his kindness, because it was only thanks to him that they were able to return to their normal lives. The lizards went further into the forest to find a place where they could live. The reconnaissance group quickly discovered traces of intelligent frogs there. They could talk like lizards and could be peaceful. But all this only confirmed the guess that they should be on their guard. The frogs did not stop in that place, which means they were also scouting the surrounding area. They were fighting with someone, and from the tracks it was clear that there were many types of them there. So returning to the camp, Rakrak ordered more tents to be put up. This was necessary in order to scare away the number of uninvited guests. They were new to the forest, and the other tribes were watching them. And if they showed weakness, they would be immediately attacked. A few days later, they moved on to another location without encountering any frogs. In the new place, they decided to establish their own settlement and began to settle down. Using symbols, they also created a map of hunting grounds on the stone. By that time, the whole tribe had been taught to read and write, and almost everyone could read it. And in order to increase the productivity of each member, Rakrak began to keep track of their prey. Songwoon didn't expect that development would go so far in such a short time. The insect race was also growing. They had already reached level 4, and it was not the end yet. When all this was just a game, he didn't even dare to dream about something like this. But despite all the advantages, all this was only the beginning. And there were still many dangers ahead that they had not yet encountered. Sometime later, the excited scout ran to Rakrak, and he told him that frogs were approaching them. Several frogs, together with their leader, came forward to negotiate. Rakrak took a few lizards with him and went forward for the same reason. And from there I saw that among the ranks of frogs there was also a lizard. The fact that he was among them indicated that the frogs did not want to fight. The representative of the frog group was the son of the leader of the frog tribe, Shunan. They really didn't want to fight, they just wanted to take their lands back. But nothing could confirm the words that these were their lands, because when the lizards arrived there, they found no signs of boundaries. But in reality, they didn't try very hard to look for them. Therefore, Rakrak asked the representative for forgiveness for his insolence, and he began to ask permission to stay in those lands for some time. His sweet talk won over the representative, and he promised that they would allow it. It was obvious that they had not come there with evil intentions, but to take a closer look at the new tribe. But questions about the lizard among them still remained unanswered. The representative refused the offer to visit the lizard settlement. They were still almost strangers, and it would be unwise to go there. But when asked to celebrate right there, he agreed. For both representatives of their tribes, it was an opportunity to get to know each other better. Rakrak remained curious about the lizard in their ranks and their true intentions, but he preferred not to ask about it as a precaution. Instead, he decided to find out about the feathers that were around the representative's neck. These were the feathers of a dangerous animal that lived in these forests, the cockatrice. In appearance, they resembled huge birds, and their paws were adorned with sharp claws. In addition, they were poisonous and fast, which made hunting them very difficult. Because of them, the frog tribe kept a close eye on this area, and for hunting they used only bows and arrows, and they had no other weapons. When asked to show what it was, the representative readily agreed, and when the lizard brought him a quiver and a bow, he also asked him to hang up a target. All this time, Rakrak watched the lizard trying to understand something on his own. Once everything was prepared, the representative showed how to shoot, and he hit the target the first time. In their tribe, everyone learned to shoot from childhood, and he was one of the best. Rakrak immediately became interested in the new type of weapon. Although the damage from the bow was less than that from the spear, it had its advantages. It was also much more difficult to handle than a spear. Of the 10 arrows that the lizard fired, not one hit the target. Once he was finished, Owen was told to pick up the arrows. Rakrak immediately saw this as an opportunity to talk to him without raising suspicion, and having returned the bow to its owner, he came up to help collect the arrows. At the same time, he asked how the lizards ended up with the frogs and why they needed it. The lizards said that they live in one tribe to help each other in these forests. In exchange for protection, the lizards help the frogs in other ways. Gather supplies and do things that require long periods of time outdoors. He spoke of everything as if the lizards could not stand up for themselves, and it was as if this was the only way to survive in these forests. But something in his words and behavior made Rakrak wary. He quickly interrupted the conversation and told them to forget what they were talking about. After some time, the meat was cooked and everyone started eating. The frogs were surprised by how cooking affected the taste of the meat. But what surprised the representative even more was that their new neighbors had live buffalo. He was so happy that he was ready to buy one for a few bows and arrows. However, a murderous look from one of his assistants quickly made him change his mind. But Rakrak did not insist, becoming increasingly entrenched in his suspicions. The representative brought up the point that lizards and frogs live together just fine. And then, as if by chance, he asked Owen to confirm these words and tell about his life. If Rakrak hadn't talked to the lizard before, he might have believed his words. But now it all looked to him as if it had all been rehearsed in advance. The sun began to set and both groups decided to separate. But before that, they agreed to meet again at the same place. The frogs waved goodbye to their new neighbors and left first. But Owen glanced back at Rakrak several times through the group until they were completely out of sight. And this only once again confirmed his guess that something was fishy there. As soon as the frogs reached the shore of the lake, Shunan began to beat the lizard Owen. He saw Owen talking to the lizard chieftain and wanted to find out what they were talking about. The lizard did not say what they were talking about and lied that he was giving advice on shooting. Even though he couldn't shoot, he lied about it to deflect suspicion. And then he pretended that he couldn't tell everything because he had to pay for it. According to him, after this, Rakrak gave up the idea because he had nothing to offer. The frogs believed him and were pleased with his actions. In the middle of the lake, there was a small island on which stood huts hidden by bushes. Inside were small lizard children, and among them was Owen's child. Shunan reminded him of this and noted that he was very lucky. Initially, the frogs wanted to offer these children as a sacrifice to their god. But now that another tribe of lizards has appeared, the need for this has gone away. And now it was Owen's job to deceive that tribe, so that they would become new victims to God and replace children. When it all just began, the frogs warmly welcomed the lizard tribe. Even then, it was possible to suspect something, but no one did so. Everything became completely clear when the two tribes decided to hold a brotherhood ceremony. The lizardmen went with the frogs to a banquet held in the center of the island. They didn't yet know that most of them would be sacrificed. But even then, even if they knew, they would not have been able to resist. On the side of the frogs was a god, a huge two-headed snake with giant teeth. He accepted only intelligent beings as sacrifices, and the lizardmen were fed to him. And he commanded the frogs in the same way that they commanded the lizards. Owen believed that the same thing awaited the other tribe of lizards. Although they were several times more numerous, they were still savages and did not even know about onions. The fact that another tribe would be fed to the god gave Owen and his tribe a little more time, and for a time it saved his son from the fate of being eaten. After some time, representatives of both tribes met again. This time, the lizardmen brought a buffalo with them to exchange for a bow. And while Shunan was wondering whether it was worth doing, Owen took the floor. He kindly suggested that they get to know each other better first, and Rakrak, as the leader of his tribe, could visit them to get to know them better. In fact, the Rakrak tribe had already tried to copy the lizard bow, but despite the fact that they perfectly recreated the shape and appearance of the bow, it was all in vain. They made the bowstring from a different material, and the shooting range turned out to be less than that of the original. The fifth meeting of representatives of the two tribes was approaching. The frog's sudden friendliness still made Rakrak wary. At the upcoming meeting, they already needed to achieve something, but the problem was that they had no information about the frog's real plans. And Owen the lizard could be the solution to this problem. Meanwhile, back at the frog settlement, Owen was being punished again. Despite all his attempts to gain Rakrak's trust, he failed. The lizards from this tribe were very different from his tribe and were more cautious. But he didn't have enough time to act slowly. The leader of the frogs ordered Shunan to perform the sacrifice ceremony as soon as possible. This was because the scabies disease of the leader and elders was only getting worse. There was no doubt that scabies was a dangerous disease. Not only did it make her whole body itch, but it was also covered in white mucus. There was no way to wash it off, and it continued to cover the frog's body, until the amount of it became so large that it became difficult to breathe. After this, death came, and one of the priests had already died in this way. The lizards weren't supposed to know about this. There would definitely be those who would be happy about it. But Shunan still told Owen everything to test him. He reacted exactly as expected. But still, it couldn't be kept a secret all the time. Owen suggested telling the lizardmen that the threat could affect them too. This way the spread of rumors could be stopped. In fact, the lizards were not afraid of scabies. Therefore, in order to deceive them, one could use herbs with the corresponding effect. And since he came into contact with frogs more often than others, he could have been the first to become infected. Shunan agreed with his plan and praised him for his insight. And he even promised to free him and his family from the fate of victims if he could convince the other tribe. This time, the frogs needed a much larger sacrifice. And to convince the lizards of their good intentions, they needed to be given a couple of bows. The warriors of both tribes already recognized each other by sight, so the fifth meeting went very well. Those who brought new goods for exchange began to talk to each other and bargain. But even the goods that Rakrakam brought were not enough. Exchange for onions was still impossible due to lack of trust in the frogs. After another such reminder, Rakrak thought for a moment, and then he asked Shunan to fulfill one request in exchange for his trust. He wanted to have a one-on-one conversation with the lizard Owen. Eventually, both lizards went further away from the others, deeper into the forest. On the way, the lizard talked about his life with the frogs, lying in the right places. At the same time, he promised to be an open book and answer all questions. And I expected the same from the interlocutor who wanted to talk. At some point, a blue butterfly flew to them and landed on the lizard's head. This butterfly was the reason why Rak stopped doubting. And he told his interlocutor the whole truth about himself and his tribe. The success achieved pleased the frogs, and the lizards agreed to come into the trap. Before this, they themselves went to the lizard settlement, which seemed like a trap. They managed not only to find out where the settlement was located and what its size was, but also to find out how many individuals there were. There were about 300 of them, and 30 of them were warriors. Lizard Owen played a major role in this, and Shunin reminded him of this. But the lizard refused any reward, reminding that what he had been promised was enough for him. But since the frog had already forgotten about it, he had to remind her that he had been promised. Finally, Shunin repeated his promise and left him. Owen continued to sit on the shore and look at the huts with children. His heart was full. He felt that his long-time dream had finally come true. Regardless of what happened to the other lizards or frogs, it no longer concerned him. Somewhere in the depths of his consciousness, he still remembered Rak. He taught him the literacy that their tribe used, and even accepted Owen's suggestion to combine letters to form other words. He didn't even tell the frogs about this because they didn't bother him. He said he was only concerned about the trust that could exist between him and Owen. He didn't believe anything they said about frogs. So I tried to convince him that they understood him and that he was confused. That once his tribe too was frightened and confused, and they knew suffering firsthand. Owen knew this Rak was overconfident. He and his warriors could do nothing against the frogs and their faith. They had never even seen real monsters, and they couldn't even leave a scratch on a snake. Rak seemed prudent, but it was very naive and stupid of him to trust so much. Even Owen himself didn't understand why this lizard had decided to trust him and believe in him at all. After some time, Rak and his warriors arrived at the frog's territory, where they were immediately met by Shunin, who was in high spirits. The lizards explained their weapon by saying that they were afraid of meeting a cockatrice on the way, but the frog didn't care about that. He was still going to get them drunk and poison them. All this time, Owen helped to arrange places for the feast. In the places where the lizards were supposed to sit, he drew some signs. Shunin left the lizards and went to check the readiness of the food. Meanwhile, Rak and his warriors headed towards Owen to say hello. But as soon as he saw what was written on the ground, he immediately understood everything. Even though the lizard spoke out loud, each place had a symbol painted on it that meant a lie. So Rak didn't wait and immediately gave the order for them to destroy all the frogs. The warriors did not need much time to prepare. At the same moment the order was given, the spear in Yura's hand flew through the air and pierced the frog warrior's head. Later, everyone else joined him and began to kill frogs. Eventually, they killed all the frog warriors who were there. But while they were busy, many of the frogs, including their representative, escaped. Before going after them, Rak made one last request of Owen. Meanwhile, Shunin gathered all the frogs in the village to attack back. They left the lizards that were under their control in the village. After that, they covered the lizards with a hail of poisoned arrows. The lizards prepared for such a move in advance and made metal shields. The arrows bounced off the metal, failing to penetrate it. Although the frogs did not expect this, Shunin ordered them to continue shooting at the lizards. This was necessary in order to prevent the lizards from advancing further. Suddenly, the sky was filled with smoke coming from the direction of the village. He spoiled their view so much that the frogs could no longer see where they were shooting. The smoke was caused by Owen, who was burning houses in the village. He did this at the request of Rak, believing that he would save his tribe from oppression. His relatives thought that it was Shunin who ordered the village to be burned so that the lizards wouldn't take it. The real reason shocked them even more, and they couldn't believe Owen's words about victory after he deceived everyone. But they quickly realized that if this sly man was risking everything, then they should do the same. The tips of the lizards' wooden clubs caught fire and they joined in the arson. The frogs, led by Shunin, checked what was happening and were convinced of their guesses. The lizards from the village had also betrayed them, and now they had to retreat. All that remained was to decide where to retreat. Someone suggested stepping away and reuniting with Shunin's assistant, Oboy. But Shunin himself, although he had no doubts about his fighting skills, decided not to do this, and use a more effective method and destroy the lizards on the island. Oboy was at the top of the village, waiting for Shunin to arrive. There were 45 frog warriors in total, but they were all scattered throughout different parts of the village. However, the numerical advantage was still on their side. To be on the safe side, he ordered his soldiers to coat their arrows with deadly poison. The warrior's intuition seemed to warn him of the impending danger. As soon as something appeared from behind the bushes, it became clear that this was not just a feeling. Arrows coated with frog poison immediately flew into the bushes, but the large creature that appeared from behind the bushes did not stop moving, frightening the opponents even more. Soon it appeared completely. It was a Manhua controlled by a lizard. In these fertile lands he grew even stronger and became more powerful. And now before him was a whole feast of different frogs. The arrows couldn't even scratch his skin. On the contrary, they only angered the Manhua even more, and he attacked again. Oh boy barely managed to avoid his attack, but his kinsman was not so lucky. This monster was unlike anything they had ever encountered. Having decided to poison the Manhua at any cost, he tore off the frog's legs and threw them into his mouth. Following his example and words, the others did the same. They all thought that the Manhua, having eaten the frogs, would die from the poison. However, Zal quickly made it clear to the frogs that this was a failed undertaking, because they were under the blessings of the bug god. One of the blessings gave immunity from poison and eliminated the possibility of poisoning. And now the completely defenseless and unarmed frogs have finally become food. Meanwhile, the lizards reached the village and finished off the remaining warriors there. However, they never found Shunan, so they assumed that he had escaped. But thanks to all the commotion, the brown lizards also began to attack the frogs. However, despite everything, the great leader of the frog tribe, Alroy, never showed up. But this was already Songwon's own fault. The disease that struck Alroy targeted the mucous membranes of amphibians. He found her around the same time that the lizards had just left the oasis. Then, with the help of flies and insects, he carried it many kilometers. And he struck the leader of the frog tribe with it, causing him to disappear. Even sacrifices did not help him to heal from his illness. However, Alroy did not give up trying to get rid of her. Even when the entire settlement burned down, he performed a ritual, sacrificing the lizard children. When Shunan reached the island, he discovered that several frogs had gotten there earlier, and the outlines of the two-headed monster he saw again gave him hope for victory. Meanwhile, Owen ran to the head of the black lizards in panic. According to him, they urgently needed to go to the island in the middle of the lake. Now he regretted his silence and told the whole truth about the frog's intentions. Rakrak wasn't surprised. He expected him to hide something from him. But now he could do nothing. The frogs had long since sailed away in their boats. He did not give orders to guard the boats because he thought they were simply fleeing to another village. However, Owen continued to beg for help, not listening to the fact that it was too dangerous. At some point, he even started crying because his son was among the children. This enraged Rakrak so much that he hit him in the face with all his might. It was too late to do anything now, and everything would have been different if Owen had trusted him. They could easily defeat God if they only knew of his existence. Zayol arrived just as the monster emerged from the water. The frogs rejoiced, believing that they would be avenged and that God would help them. And the lizards were now watching what was happening on the island. Child murder could still be prevented, but it carried enormous risks. And Rakrak was not sure what to do until a butterfly suddenly appeared. And he did not see anything on the island that gave hope for a good outcome. A huge praying mantis loomed over the two-headed serpent. For some time, the frogs did not notice the presence of anyone else on the island. But as soon as they noticed that the snake was looking behind them, they noticed him. The appearance and size of the praying mantis led them to believe that it was a god. In fact, it was a creature that Songwon created from essence. Few players could boast of such progress at an early stage of the game. The creature was so strong that the two-headed snake could do nothing to it. The snake tried to scare the mantis and attack with one of its heads, but its attack was easily blocked. After this, the frogs scattered in all directions, trying not to get hit. Since the snake's second head remained free, he tried to attack with it. Some frogs even decided that their god could win. But this attempt of his also failed, and his head was destroyed. The mantis continued to hold the first head of the snake in his hands, and he in turn continued to convulse but was still breathing and alive. Songwon decided to make a show of killing this to scare the frogs even more. This serpent was not actually a god, but only pretended to be one, so the mantis tore him to pieces, so that he could atone for his guilt and become a sacrifice to the real god. At the same time, he voiced the reasons for this out loud to make everything even more frightening. Thus, the two-headed monster was easily defeated by a skill of enormous power. The lizards on the other side of the river began to joyfully praise their god, but Songwon was focused on studying his creature and the loot that dropped. Although the snake was inferior to the creature in strength and size, it was still defeated suspiciously easily. From the corpse of the monster, Songwon obtained the essence of the evil spirit. And then the system said that he could open the area where this snake lived. Then everything became clear. The power of the snake was reduced due to the wrong habitat. Usually such snakes lived in seawaters, but the water in the lake was fresh. But since Songwon didn't need such a habitat yet, he put it aside. The frogs had to flee in a hurry to another village. They were so blinded by the power of the serpent that when it was destroyed, they could not continue to fight. When everything was finished, Songwon sent the creature to rest until next time. It immediately obeyed and disappeared, leaving no trace behind. After that, everything became quiet, and Rakrak began to plan his next steps. They were going to go after the frogs that had fled to the village. However, to do this, they needed a volunteer who could lead them to the village. Since their route lay through the island and he needed to visit his son, Owen volunteered. The lizards with clubs that suddenly appeared also wanted to join in and help. Rakrak tried to leave them behind because they were wounded and could not fight, but the lizards continued to insist on their own. All of them once lost their loved ones who became victims of the snake. So now that the opportunity had arisen, they were desperate to avenge them. They had every right to do so Rakrak allowed them to go with him. Even before all this happened, he learned how to hit a target with a bow. Then he was given advice not to think too much before shooting because the target would be moving. First, it was necessary to slow down or stop the victim and then finish him off. After the friendship between their tribes was established, the frogs promised to teach them how to make bows. They themselves were made from simple materials and any lizard could obtain them. A large group of lizardmen swam across the lake without sticking their muzzles out of the water. As soon as they reached the island, the parents immediately rushed to their children. Rakrak examined the weak and the children and ordered Ur to use the remaining boats and take them away from the island. They were going to attack the frogs from two sides. Therefore, it was necessary to move another group to the lower part of the village. Everything promised to go well because after the victory over the snake, another blessing appeared. This gave the lizards an advantage in the water. Their scales were difficult to see in the moonlight. Everything went according to plan, and the lizards really managed to catch the frogs by surprise. A massacre ensued, with few frogs able to resist the onslaught. In the end, they were all killed with spears. So it was Alroy's turn, who immediately began to call out to his god. However, this did not help him, and soon he was killed just like the others. Shunan was in no hurry to join the fight and hid behind one of the houses. What happened there shocked him, and it was useless to join. His father was dead, and arrows were useless against the lizards. He continued to watch Rakrak until he suddenly realized that he had lost him. Almost at the same moment, Rakrak snuck up on him from behind. Realizing his powerlessness, Shunan didn't even try to fight, and instead he tried to appeal to their old friendship. And he began to prove that everything that happened was not his fault, and he did not wish any harm. But the lizard did not seem convinced by such nonsense. Then the frog offered to reveal the secret of making bows. This interested Rakrak a little. The secret was to use tendons. However, these were not simple tendons, but from the backs of lizards. Shunan spoke about it out loud, and by doing so, he dug his own grave. But when he had already resigned himself to his fate, he was ordered to run as far as possible. Considering this a pardon, he immediately rushed towards the forest. But Rakrak had no intention of letting him go. He just needed a moving target. And as soon as the frog had run far enough, he shot it with his bow. With that one shot, he knocked Shunan off his feet. And at that very moment, enraged lizards attacked the frog. And soon he went through everything that the lizard people threatened to do to him. After his victory, Rakrak continued to train with the bow. Only now they used a tied-up frog corpse as a target. He had improved his skills with it greatly, and even Owen had noticed. However, their bows still had problems with the string. Even though they made it from frog tendons, it didn't last long. But for now, they didn't have better material, and they had to make do with this. Rakrak understood that very soon they would have to leave this forest too, to move closer to winter, to warmer regions where the buffalo will go. Owen and his tribe took care of the remaining frogs, and they were no longer in danger. While they were talking, they were being watched by a child whom Zal quickly discovered. It turned out that he had brought a statue of the keeper that he had carved. Rakrak examined the statuette and noticed that it was a good thing. The child beamed at his praise and suggested that he keep the statuette for himself. Owen only encouraged this because making such items was popular among children. There were quite a lot of children in this tribe, and this was confirmed by the child himself. They chose to make the guardian because he saved them. Since it was only one statue, Rakrak decided to look for more in the village. He was ready to pay any price for such figurines. After this, the conversation returned to the previous topic, about Owen discovering something strange in the cave where the frogs were hiding. Sometime later, he brought Rakrak to the entrance of this cave. There was nothing to be afraid of. All the frogs were killed, so they entered there without hesitation. They reached the strange object quite quickly. It turned out to be a round stone with pictures engraved on it. The lizards were amazed by the detail of this engraving, but the Rakrak tribe had already seen something similar on the back of a centipede. Songwoon immediately realized that these were ancient ruins. There were many such ruins, and they mostly provided knowledge or miracles, but there were also artifacts. At this level of development, ancient knowledge was not important for the lizards. Getting caught in the ruins wouldn't be so bad, but only if they weren't demonic ruins. It was possible to enter the ruins by moving the stone, which is what the lizards did, and then a voice was heard that welcomed them to the demonic world. They walked forward up the stairs, looking around. This place was quite deep and there were more stairs ahead. But suddenly difficulties began. There was a flock of creatures on the stairs. These were nutria, which were obviously hostile to the guests. But because their behavior was different from usual, Rakrak called them monster rats, and he ordered the others to prepare for battle since the rats could be guarding this place. At that very moment, the nutria rushed to attack. The battle that began ended rather quickly with the defeat of the rats. After the victory, the question arose whether these nutria could be eaten. In the end, it was decided to gut them and take them with them. Rakrak wanted to suggest breeding them in the village, but Owen came up with a better idea. His proposal was to start fish farming there. This required some thought to be given to the details, and he intended to do so upon his return. Suddenly, one of the warriors dealing with the rat monster screamed. Despite the injury he received, it did not appear that he had been bitten, and according to him, he felt a sharp, burning pain in his hand just after touching the monster. Rakrak decided to test his words and touched the nutria himself. There was a bright spark, and his hand was also pierced with pain. Only Songwoon could see that this nutria had the ability of electricity. It was only because she was possessed by a demon. These were demonic ruins, after all, and the electric demons were part of them. Despite the danger, there was a chance for those who could break through them to gain demonic power. But this did not guarantee that they would immediately become magicians. And the problem was that magic and divinity were opposites. Magic came from ancient evil, and its study did not require the intervention of the gods. Thanks to her, beings could become powerful even without gods. A large number of such magicians could promise destruction for the god. Now the demonic ruins tried to tempt Rakrak into gaining their powers. In front of him was a demonic spirit that spoke to him through thoughts. Sunwon considered whether to warn Rakrak of the danger, but decided not to. Because after checking his statistics, I discovered a unique ability that didn't exist before. This was a trick, and it appeared after defeating the frogs and Shunan. The spirit promised to grant the lizard the power of electricity, the same as his own. Rakrak was not against it, and on the contrary would have been grateful for it. But there were certain conditions that had to be met to receive it. This disappointed the lizard since there was no talk of a deal in the first place, but he forced the spirit to tell about all the conditions and dangers without concealment, because if he tries to hide anything, their deal will fail. Before fully listening to the spirit, Rakrak sent his subordinates away. Then the spirit told him that he was locked in these rabbis and could not get out. He wanted the lizard to come down and defeat the guard protecting the seal, and as soon as he does this, he will receive abilities as a reward. This ability was extremely powerful and could do more than just create sparks. Moreover, thanks to it, one could become stronger than God. This power could also be transferred to other members of the tribe through a special ritual. The lizard still doubted the veracity of his words. Something in his story didn't add up. But even if he was sealed only because of his power, he was still too dangerous. Eventually, the spirit confessed that it had once been one of the beings that ruled the world. He was descended from a long-forgotten demon whose origins were unknown even to the gods. The abilities that the demonic power gave were uncontrollable and intoxicated the creatures. The effect was similar to that of beings intoxicated with power. The spirit's abilities were random and their owner was chosen at random. On the other hand, God independently chose who to give power to. Therefore, anyone could master the abilities of the spirit and develop them. And eventually, there would be those who would desecrate God and rebel against him. Although this power could help in battle, accepting the offer was risky. Eventually, Rakrak agreed to help, but on his own terms. He intended to grant abilities only to a select few from his tribe. If abilities are given only to a select few, everyone else will consider them a gift from God. Then the creatures will not contradict God because they will believe that he has given them all their powers. Rakrak also wanted the spirit to believe in his God. This was the second condition. For the most part, the gods hated the spirits, despite the fact that they were much older than them. The god of beetles was not like the other gods and did not look down on everyone, so he accepted even the demonic spirit as his believer. Then the spirit decided to admit that he had lied and had not been locked up in the first place. He ruled this place, and all this was a test to see if he was fit to receive powers. However, Rakrak forgave him because he understood that he had been in this place alone for many years. And I wanted the spirit to come out and see how beautiful the world is. Thus, the lizard was able to pass the test and receive the promised ability. This is what happened once Songwoon accepted the spirit as his believer. This was the end of the story of how the chosen ones appeared among the lizard tribe. 9 years have passed since then, and much has changed in the world. At the top of the hill stood two figures hidden by cloaks, and in front of them stood an altar. The man who was told this story decided that they should get acquainted and introduced himself. However, his interlocutor did not respond in kind, instead focusing on the movement in front of them. Hyena people were climbing the hill and they didn't look friendly. Hyenas and lizards were at odds with each other because they believed in different gods. The approaching group of hyenas was poorly armed and not vigilant, so the lizard decided to defeat them alone using his abilities. The hygienists, in turn, only discovered that something was wrong when the arrow landed at their feet, and at that very moment they were struck by the shock that came from the arrow. Those who weren't hit so hard had no choice but to run away. The lizard who told the story of the appearance of the Chosen Ones was Owen. He was quite famous all over the world and was considered great. The man he was talking to couldn't even imagine that he was talking to someone like that. Later, to replenish his strength, the lizard used ritual attributes. Watching him, the man wondered why he was following a god with such power. He didn't mean it as betrayal, but he also didn't understand why Owen would voluntarily choose the life of a wanderer. But in reality, all this was a redemption that God gave him a chance for. He once betrayed many of his people and chose this path for himself. His interlocutor, although he said that he was also a wanderer, was not actually one. He came from automation to convey the words of her master to the lizard tribe. The automation itself was an isolated settlement located in the southwestern wilderness. Upon learning this, Owen decided to help him get to the tribe in Rakrak. As soon as he whistled, a huge bird resembling a basilisk ran up to him. Noticing his companion's concern, he explained that she was not dangerous and only half basilisk. Then he climbed into the saddle and invited his companion to follow his example, and in exchange for his help, he took from him a promise to listen to the rest of the story about Rakrak. The lizard tribe, led by Rakrak, moved towards a place they could call home. That was until the messenger reported that their astrologer was on his deathbed, and before he died, he wanted to talk to the leader if he was not busy. Then the order was given to stop the procession, and the whole tribe immediately stopped. Rakrak himself immediately headed towards the astrologer. But before that, he told Zale to take care of his funeral. The old lizard man did a lot for the tribe and became like an elder to them. So it promised to be a hard night for everyone. The other lizard set up a tent so that he could be comfortable. As soon as Rakrak entered there, the doctor confirmed that the stargazer did not have much time left. However, the astrologer himself was not afraid of death, but on the contrary was glad to meet it. He lived a long life and experienced a lot during that time. Eventually, the time came when fatigue and exhaustion overtook him too. And the only question that now worried him was what awaited them after death. It was only because of him that he called Rakrak, because he was the closest to God. But even he could not answer this question because there were many guesses. All they could do when someone died was pray that they would go to a good place, and hope that the God who took care of them during life will take care of them after death. Then the astrologer asked how he imagined the place they would end up in, and Rakrak happily told about his idea of that place, that there will be fields and rivers and the weather will always be pleasant. For some time, both lizards discussed what could be in that place, until a blue butterfly flew into the tent and landed on Rakrak's hand. At the same moment this happened, the elderly astrologer's eyes began to darken. This butterfly meant that God was watching and listening to them. The two lizards exchanged a few more words before the butterfly flew up to the stargazer. And as soon as his last breath reached her wings, she flew out of the tent. And then she continued to fly in the sky, leaving the tribe of black lizards. Unlike the others, Song-Woon knew very well what happened after death. After receiving the peacefully departed soul, he was given the opportunity to create an afterlife. Although he didn't fully understand what the terms meant, he immediately created it. The afterlife was one of the important elements of the lost world. There was a division there, as in the Bible, which was necessary to maintain morality. Good souls went to a kind of heaven, while the wicked were doomed to torment. Besides this, there was also Valhalla, where warriors went to train. Subsequently, such trained souls could be sent back to Earth. After completing all the necessary preparations, Song-Woon created the ancient meadow, and after that he immediately placed the soul of the astrologer there. Not much time passed before the lizard woke up and looked around. There was a green meadow around which Rakrak had told him about before his death. There were no stars or stone houses, but everything else was amazing. There was a chance that the houses in this place would not be needed. It was a good gift in itself. Eventually he noticed that he was not alone in this place. Here and there on the grass lay other lizardmen facing the sky with their eyes closed. They all looked like they were fast asleep, so it would have been impolite to wake them up. Among the other lizardmen, the stargazer was able to see several familiar faces. One of them was a young lizard, a warrior who had once learned arithmetic from him. He died when the Goblin Alliance failed the defense and set up an ambush. Then the goblins united and outnumbered their clan several times. The elderly and children could not fight, and could not even hold out until reinforcements arrived. And when they already thought that this was the end, this lizard stepped forward. He and several warriors disobeyed orders because they thought it necessary. They believed that it was right to sacrifice a few lives to save the majority, and they made a heroic sacrifice that no one wanted. At their funeral, Rakrak became enraged and began to curse both those who survived and those who died. He even scolded the astrologer because he taught them arithmetic. But he was angry not because they did wrong, but quite the opposite. The feat of the warrior, who was fast asleep in front of the astrologer, inspired many others to learn calculations. Therefore, the astrologer was incredibly happy to meet him in this place. Deciding not to wake him, the lizard continued to explore the place he had found himself in. He couldn't believe that there really wasn't a drop of divinity there. Noticing a shadow hiding behind one of the trees, he called out to its owner. However, he started running without even trying to answer. Then the astrologer decided that he knew something and rushed after him. Thus he came to an amazing building that was hidden behind the trees. There were a lot of thoughts going through his head as he walked in. What he wanted most of all was to know why God was so kind to them. Why were lizards superior to many other races, and what role did God play in this? All this could have been a simple coincidence or the result of achievements. Nobody knew the answers to these questions, but in the end, everything was fine without that. The stargazer walked down the corridor and found himself in front of a telescope pointed at the sky. As he climbed the stairs leading up to it, the lizard couldn't help but admit that Rakrak was right. He paused for a moment, figuring out what was what and touching different parts of the device. Then he finally looked into the eyepiece of the telescope. Several more times he tore himself away from the eyepiece to look at the sky with the naked eye. The stars in the starry sky were not the same as what he saw when he was on Earth. So he decided to deepen his knowledge and correct what he was wrong about. The god the astrologer had wanted to meet all this time was standing right behind him. All the lizard's assumptions were correct, the faith of God was important, and the afterlife influenced views on life after death and the values of beings. Therefore, Song Woon gave the astrologer opportunities for development and training. The study of the laws of this world by scientists was supposed to lead to technological progress in the future. The afterlife changed and led to unexpected results due to attacks from other players. A new threat was approaching in the form of a tribe of hyenas who were superior to the lizards in everything. Everything about them spoke of the fact that behind them stood a player who was their god. The battle with them promised to be difficult, and Song Woon prepared to greet them with dignity. For the past few years, he has been busy keeping an eye on players expanding their territory. Song Woon managed to hinder other players' farming progress with the help of locusts. He had 3 swarms of beetles in total, and the flies were useful for spreading diseases. He also had a nest where he raised various types of beetles. Most of the lizard tribes now submitted to Rakrak, who united them. So establishing complete control over the southern peninsula was only a matter of time. Owen and his companion reached the lizard's campsite before the sun rose. There, one of the lizards told them that the astrologer had died and they were having a funeral. The man tried to refuse their visit, considering it impolite. But in the lizard tribe, it was considered a good sign when a stranger came to a funeral. Later, both creatures came to the place where the funeral was held and Rakrak was standing. To the man's surprise, Rakrak also cried without thinking about his authority. However, in the lizard tribe, tears were not a sign of weakness, because they had something that they revered with much more authority. Finally, the ceremony ended, and the chief turned his attention to the arrivals. He exchanged a few words with Owen before the man introduced himself. The stranger arrived on assignment but did not share the details with anyone. After this, both lizards exchanged a few whispers with each other. Later, they went into the tent to discuss why the man had come to the tribe. He told about his mission and gave the lizard leader a salt stone as a gift. Automation was engaged in the extraction of salt, which was considered very valuable. This was the first stone, and his lord was going to present many more if they came to an agreement. The lizard, however, clenched his fist, which contained rock salt, with great force. It crumbled and fell to the floor under the ambassador's shocked gaze. At the same time, Rakrak ordered to convey that he accepted the gift presented by the Lord well, and everything that happened was just one of the rituals to appease God. The people of Automation had no god, but the man knew that this was a blatant lie. Eventually, he tried to reach out to the leader to come to an agreement. However, this did not give anything, and it was not even because they were different races. Rakrak was not rude and refused the offer diplomatically enough. He didn't like to accept offers that others refused. He also didn't like collecting things, which made the offer unprofitable. Still, it's unlikely that Owen actually stumbled upon him by accident. The fact that he offered this to others proved that he came from the north, while Automation was in the west. In the north, there was a tribe of hyenas with cropped ears. The fact that he returned and went further meant that the leader of that tribe refused him, and in order for their conversation to continue, it was necessary for the man himself to tell the whole truth. The Automation was incredibly protected thanks to its high walls. Behind these walls, humans and several tribes of other creatures coexisted. Automation also had a geographical advantage over other settlements. The valley where it was located led to the continent, and that was why it was so protected. There were salt mines in this area where people mined salt, which was useful for livestock and food. Meanwhile, Rakrak continued to insist that the man tell him the truth. However, he was in no hurry to do this and reveal himself. Then the lizard decided to reveal his identity on his own. He already understood who it was, and that in fact it was the Lord of Automation himself, and not just a messenger, despite the fact that even within the automation few knew his name and appearance. He introduced himself as Hui, and only the names of the Lord's relatives contained the same. The Lord had 4 sons and 3 daughters, and the newcomer was not young or a woman. That's how he guessed that the Lord of Automation was in front of him. After this, the man stopped hiding and was surprised by the lizard's insight. According to him, even the fact that he was a lord did not change anything, and he simply gave the salt. However, it was clear to everyone that this was payment. Even the greedy hyenas refused it. And this salt was presented in exchange for the protection of automation. Even though it sounded like a good deal, it really wasn't. There was nothing to stop the lizards or other creatures from driving out the people and taking over the automation. Rakrak had no intention of attacking, but he was still thinking about what would be more beneficial for them. Diplomacy and this whole deal would have achieved nothing, and it would be much more profitable for the lizards to capture automation. Even with losses, they would have succeeded because they had a strong god on their side. Moreover, the Lord was not afraid to come to them alone, and he himself made the task easier. The Lord himself was sure that the lizards would not kill him, so he came there. After all, if he dies, they won't be able to find out who the next heir will be. In the end, they were all just part of a game that had already begun long ago. It was a game similar to Go, where even he was one of the stones. The 2 gods played with their tribes like stones, and they made the first moves. They began to approach the children of Hui, and so he mentioned the heir. At some point, some of the children began to talk about a mouth with teeth and others about a blue butterfly. Both gods planned to seize power in automation, having recruited the future leader in advance. A few weeks before, Song-Woon received a call from Hegemony. He was the god of the hyenas that arrived in those parts. And unlike their last fight, this time Hegemony was going to win. However, Song-Woon had no intention of fighting, as it was pointless. However, he knew the playing style of his former opponent. Despite his outward simplicity, Hegemony was strong and multitasking, and there were many cases when he won the battle at the very beginning. Since they needed the same thing, Song-Woon suggested a different way to solve the situation. With people in the city at stake, they planned to settle the matter with a contradictory prophecy. Prophecy was a skill that was unlocked at the 6th level of divinity. This was a quest that the player gave himself, and there was a penalty for not completing it. In turn, the contradictory prophecy gave one side a reward and the other a penalty. The prophecy itself was supposed to be about the next Lord of Automation, and it had to answer the question of which of the 5 children would become him. To do this, each of them had to choose one of the children. Before they began their selection, Hegemony spoke about each child. Otherwise, he's from the eldest, whose name was Dan and who was the strongest candidate. The second son, Zhong, was considered a weakling by the people and did not strive to become the heir. The third daughter was Dan's sister and preferred to hide her origins. She got along well with rough folk and was second favorite for the post. 4th daughter Ken was born to another mother who died suddenly. She was considered cursed and because of this, was despised by all members of the family, including the Lord. The last daughter, Min, was much younger than the others, but her father loved her more than the others. Song-Woon didn't waste time thinking and told them to decide right away. However, first they had to write their predictions separately from each other. After doing this, they looked to see if their predictions differed or not. Hegemony chose his first son as his candidate for successor, while Sung-Woon chose the 4th daughter, even though it seemed stupid. There was silence for a moment as his opponent had not expected this. But he quickly decided that it was none of his business, since the condition was met. After confirming the choice, the system announced that their contradictory prophecy had been accepted. That is why the man came to the lizards to find the source of the spreading rumors. Both tribes that were heading towards automation were too strong, and seeing the reaction of the lizard leader, he was convinced that they had something to do with the rumors. However, he was still alive and therefore was also a piece on the board, and now he had to choose the less dangerous of 2 evils. However, despite everything, he had no intention of taking either side. If both groups go to war, he will not win even if he is on the winning side. In Rakrak's eyes, this meant that he had decided to retreat and do nothing. The man humbly accepted his fate as a simple stone on the gaming board. All he was left wondering was why Rakrak was willing to accept the same fate. But they promised to give him an answer to this question only when everything was over. After this, the man walked through the tents and came out into the open wasteland. At one of the hills, his people met him and gave him clothes to change into. Having finished putting himself in order, he headed back with the people. 3 weeks ago, Ken was climbing up the rock to get down safely. Her cart of silk fell from the very top of the path and was smashed to pieces. Once again, she failed at what she tried to do. Everyone thought she was cursed. They said that she killed her mother at birth. Since childhood, all sorts of unpleasant things have happened to her. After so many years, she had become accustomed to them, but she felt offended for the cart. Despite all efforts, all the silk fell out and was ruined. However, she continued to climb up until she heard a voice. It was a lizard, holding out his hand, expecting her to grab it and rise. However, the girl was wary of the unsolicited help. She was broke and had nothing to give back. And while Ken hesitated, the lizard grabbed her wrist and pulled her up. But even he was surprised by her choice of road. It was too narrow. So it was no surprise that the loaded cart simply fell down. After being asked to introduce himself, the lizard gave his name. Ken didn't linger, and after thanking him, she tried to move on. However, the lizard stopped her and, putting his hand forward, called her real name. The girl instinctively reached for the knife, asking how he knew it. The lizard replied that he knew him from Rak, who ordered him to find her. This information both reassured and surprised her. Rak was a famous thunder lizard and also the first chosen one. Everyone knew about it, and she didn't understand why someone so great needed her. The lizard assumed that it was related to the rumors that were circulating about her. Since the girl knew nothing about the rumors, he told her that she was considered a candidate for Lord. However, she did not take it seriously, as it was just a rumor. She was still an outcast, and her brother might have started this rumor on purpose. But the lizard was not going to retreat, since he had received orders to protect her. The girl tried to argue with him, but it was all useless. Eventually, she had to bare her forehead and show what was left of her horns. It was because of them that her mother died and misfortunes constantly happened to her. However, even this did not make the lizard go against the order, and he still stayed. Then Ken had no choice but to accept it. Deciding that even running was useless, she decided to go down and get the silk. But the lizard quickly reminded her that she couldn't go down with an injured leg, so she had to awkwardly ask him to do it for her. Soon they both headed towards the automation, talking to each other along the way. It wasn't long before they saw its walls on the horizon. The girl was going to discuss the sale of silk with the GE family upon her return, and she didn't even suspect that an attack was being prepared against her until it was too late. The lizard was able to block the attack, but now it became clear that Rak was right. Someone tried to kill Ken as the battle for the inheritance had already begun. Eventually, the lizard managed to catch the group of creatures that attacked them. After everything that happened, the girl realized that he was not so simple. The lizard had good fighting skills as he trained under the best warrior of the tribe, Yura. He also learned medicine while running errands for Jael. She was considered by everyone to be the female version of Rak, and she also ruled the tribe. All this information indicated that he was an important figure in the tribe, and since he was sent to protect her, he could be very useful. The girl was so carried away by her thoughts that she noticed too late that her silk had been used for bandaging. And in the end, she just had to come to terms with that too. Sometime later, they approached the automation where other creatures were crowded. This happened because the gates were closed and everything was under guard. No one could get inside, so no one knew what was going on there. It took some time before the girl was able to get to the head of the GE family. Noticing his dejected mood, she immediately began to defend herself. And all this indicated that she had not yet heard the latest news. But before telling them, the head of GE asked if anything had happened to her on the way. Ken described the attack and introduced the lizard. As expected, the GE family had no connection with the attackers. But the city was closed, not because the damned daughter was attacked. They were also attacked, but it was her brother Dan who was hit. He disappeared just when the Lord left the city. To find at least some clues, Ken and the lizard went to his home, and after a short search they succeeded. The lizard smelled blood. There were traces of wiped blood on the floor, which they clearly tried to hide. Head Gay believed that Dung was already dead, since they had found these traces a long time ago. But they couldn't prove it because they couldn't find the body. They closed it down precisely to prevent the criminal from taking the body out of the city. Even if you, the criminal, continued to keep the body, it would begin to stink. So, catching the killer was only a matter of time, and they didn't need any help. Suddenly, the voice inside Ken made itself known again, and he began to incite her, asking if she wanted to know more. From the outside, it looked like she was just frozen, staring at one point. Having come to, she said that the criminal hid the body in a container. So they had to look for someone who stored a large amount of meat. To prevent the body from rotting, he probably preserved it with salt. This was the one who could take a hunter into the castle, and who had a lot of salted meat at home. The person who fit the description perfectly was Jin, Ken's sister. All these suspicions were not unfounded, and soon everyone learned of Dan's death. Later, whispers began that Jin was the main suspect. Jin's plan might have worked if it weren't for Ken who started it, and so she had to quickly get rid of the body in case of a search. But she was not the only one who longed to become her father's heir. Wee Min and her people were already waiting for Jin in the valley to get rid of her. In her opinion, her sister had no reason to be offended by her since she herself started it. Before Jin could even answer, she was killed. But it didn't end there even though 2 heirs died. The next moment, someone pierced Min herself with a sword. It was the remaining brother whom she had completely forgotten about. In this way, he got rid of 2 rivals at once, and now there was only one person left who could stop him. But he decided not to make her wait long for his death. The next day, everyone learned that the bodies of the 3 heirs had been found. Now everyone understood that the person behind it all was none other than Huizhong. He knew the intentions of each heir and waited for them to make their move. After that, in one fell swoop, he got rid of 3 people at once. So it is possible that the goblin attack was his doing. And now Ken was left alone and in even greater danger. Now people supported Zhang because there was no better candidate. However, the Ji family still remained on Ken's side. Now all Ken had to do was survive until the Lord returned. After some time, she arrived at the council convened by the head of Ji. People there were discussing how they needed to do more than just protect Ken. But to catch Zhang, however, they still needed support. Ken stopped filing the antlers and they grew back fairly quickly. She promised the lizard not to do it after he witnessed it. It felt strange to her now, even though they weren't fully grown. And she couldn't get used to her current situation even more. Someone finally believed in her and helped her survive and win the fight. The people continued their discussion until a messenger came and brought news. The Lord of Automation was returning and was supposed to be there the next day. The messenger approached the girl under the pretext of delivering a secret message. In fact, he was going to kill him, but the lizard and the goblin managed to prevent this. This messenger was from the GE family, but he was bribed, which meant it was no longer safe there. However, leaving the GE family home was not easy. The situation was getting tense. Zhang no longer disdained methods and even began to fight against the GE family. So Ken had no choice but to escape from there through the sewers. Despite her reluctance to do so, she still did not complain. And she was the first to disappear into the hatch opening, after which she called the lizard. It was not the first time she had been in such places, so the smell did not affect her much. As a child, she fell into a cesspool and almost died, but she still managed to get out of there safe and sound. Despite the pitch darkness, fireflies lit her way. These beetles were the only thing that surprised the lizard in the whole story. Fireflies couldn't live in places like that, but they were there anyway. They finally reached the entrance of the Su family's hunting lodge. Leaving Ken behind, the lizard went to check if everything was safe. At the same time, he warned that if he did not return, she should run back. The girl was still alive only thanks to his caution, so I decided to listen and actually waited there, until she heard the sounds of battle outside. Without understanding why, she rushed up the stairs to help. She ran until she reached the exit to the yard. There, right at the entrance, stood a wounded lizard surrounded by soldiers. His wounds were so severe that he was practically a corpse. So Jin told them to ignore him and kill Ken. If he were an ordinary person, such a wound would have been more than enough to kill him. But even despite his condition, the lizard continued to protect the girl. He didn't understand why she came back because he told her to run away. The girl herself still didn't understand this. One way or another, the lizard himself did even more than he was originally ordered to do. In the end, they had to face this fight together. As the time of the Lord's arrival approached, the stakes for Ken's murder rose. Despite this, people were in no hurry to attack again, because they thought that the lizard was the chosen one and would be able to kill them. However, Jin was sure that this was not the case because he would not hide his strength that way. Having received a few seconds of respite, the lizard was able to figure out how to get away. And Ken ordered to run straight to the wall behind which was the salt mine. The warriors regained their confidence and attacked, so there was no use arguing. The lizard was able to break through the wall with its body, and the two of them ran into the mine. But there was silence for a while. What happened stunned everyone. However, the people quickly came to their senses and rushed in pursuit. This jerk cost the lizard his last strength, so Ken had to drag him on himself. They continued walking down the mine until they reached a dead end. The lizard was too weak to do anything, but he still had no intention of resting. There was nowhere to go further, and there was no way to return. They were trapped. It was all too much for Ken, and it seemed like she was to blame for it too. She believed that because of her curse, only bad things happened to those around her. However, this was not the case, and the lizard tried to explain it. They managed to survive all 3 weeks only because it was luck, not a curse. He said that he noticed something strange when he went down for the silk. The cart didn't break on its own, someone had a hand in it. And he did this not because she was one of the heirs. All her life, misfortunes did not just happen, someone tried to kill her. Ken herself understood this, but tried to find excuses for everything. It wasn't long before Jin and his men caught up with them. This time, they didn't waste time talking and immediately got down to action. Ken and the lizard could no longer run, so they prepared to defend themselves. After being reminded of the truth, the girl no longer blamed the curse for everything. Now more than ever, they needed her luck to survive. Suddenly, an electric ball appeared between them and the crowd of people. It was a demonic spirit that came there on the orders of God, to announce to the lizard that he had been chosen. Hearing this, the people stopped, consulting among themselves whether they should attack. Jin was not impressed by what happened. It was important for him to get rid of his sister as soon as possible. However, his men were still in no hurry to carry out the order. However, the lizard continued to talk to the demonic spirit. There had always been only 5 chosen ones in his tribe, and he wanted to know if that had changed. The number of the chosen ones did not change even with him since the astrologer died. And the lizard Siran was chosen only because of his qualities. Having given him power, the spirit disappeared, leaving behind only a light trace. As soon as this happened, people became bolder and rushed to attack. But the lizard was no longer weak. The strength he had received healed his wounds. And besides this, it completely restored and increased his strength. However, people did not realize this and continued to attack. So the lizard used electrical magic to deal with them. Within moments, most of the attackers were killed and the rest fled. And Jin fled with them despite all his desire to finish off Ken. Despite his mighty strength, the lizard could not use it unless necessary, because after each use, it seemed like she was trying to take over the mind. But now that his wounds had healed, they could leave the mine. Along the way, they encountered Jin's soldiers, but the lizard easily got rid of them. But Hegemony, who was watching everything from the side, could not allow Ken to survive. Having asked his opponent for forgiveness in advance, he played his trump card. And the next moment, a huge saber-toothed tiger blocked the road. It seemed that he alone was enough to deal with both creatures. However, before he could do anything, he was defeated by magic. The appearance of the tiger in the mine was even stranger than everything else. But after that, they met no one else on the way, and they managed to leave the mine. Jin was already waiting outside, and he simply couldn't let his sister go. He exchanged a few words with her, blaming only her for what happened. And then he gave the order to his men to attack from ambush. However, they failed to do this either, and they were killed. Ken continued the conversation to tell her brother that the problem was him. Zhong, like his father, had a bad attitude towards other races and was going to drive them out of automation. But automation was a trading city, and isolation would have led to total collapse. Unlike them, Ken was willing to cooperate with other races for the good of the city. Her brother did not respond to the accusations. He did not believe that she would be elected lord, but he wanted to remove her just in case. Then he suddenly opened his fan and covered his face. It was difficult to notice from the outside, but it was done to give a signal discreetly. Ken quickly realized that he had given it to the killer who was hiding in front of the warehouse. And the voice in her head suggested that he would shoot her with a bow. This time the girl decided not to shut him up and listen. They both knew they could lose their lives if they did not cooperate. The lizard would not have been able to stop the arrow and Ken would have been killed. This is exactly what the voice in my head predicted, and it was right. The only way she could have avoided death was if the wind had blown and changed the arrow's trajectory. And so it happened. The arrow flying towards her was stopped by a sudden gust of wind. This could not be called either a curse or simple luck. The creature in her head could manipulate probabilities and choose the best. So the arrow that was supposed to kill Ken landed right at her feet. The system window informed players that Ken had discovered her demonic powers. Despite her description, the curse was made up and Hegemonia couldn't believe it. He could assume that Songwoon had a hand in this, but the description was like that long before them. And even Songwoon himself was not initially confident in his guess. Eventually, it became obvious that all the bad luck cases were assassination attempts. But even though Ken was very close to death, she still survived. Watching her, he realized that she had something called probability magic. She had this ability thanks to the demonic spirit that was in her body. Even Songwoon found it very useful to own a creature with such skills. He was pulled out of his thoughts by the voice of Hegemonia, rejoicing at his victory. Hui Jung was still alive when the current lord arrived. Now the struggle was stopped, and he had to choose an heir. Hegemony believes he would choose Zhong because he shares his political views. However, Sungwoon was sure of the opposite, that he would choose Ken over Jun. But before the lord chose an heir, Ken asked him why he tried to kill her. Although this was an outrageous question, the lord was not surprised by the question, and he only confirmed her words by asking when she found out. The girl knew about this for a long time, but continued to deceive herself. She didn't want to believe that her own father wanted to kill her. It was easier to believe in a curse. After her mother's death, the lord was so consumed with grief that he could not see things clearly. Then the idea of a curse came to him. He decided that her mother died because of her horns. And since then, I just couldn't leave her alone. Since this question was decided, the lord was about to announce the heir. But Zhong suddenly exploded and began to beg his father not to be guided by feelings of guilt. But he didn't intend to do this anyway and wanted to solve everything like their father. The old lord had long since resigned himself to his role as a stone on the playing field of the gods, and his choice of successor was his last voluntary decision. At the same time, Hegemony finally realized the sudden change in circumstances. And while he was praying for Zhang to become the heir, something started to happen. Time seemed to stand still for Qian, and she was able to read the first letter of her name from her lips. However, this outcome of events still did not make her happy. After all, if her father had chosen her, dirty rumors would have spread throughout the city that the Lord tried to kill his child and gave him the post out of guilt. To prevent the city from falling apart, she had to achieve the title of Lord herself. So even before her father said her name, she stopped him, and she said that she must become a lord, regardless of who he chooses, after which she demanded that powers be transferred, thereby throwing down a challenge. Although everyone was shocked by this, the Lord reacted calmly. He was even interested in how she was going to deal with him. Since he didn't come alone, but with soldiers and even with a lizard, she couldn't do much. However, the girl quickly showed him that he was wrong, because the lizard next to her was not a simple warrior, but a chosen one. The Lord didn't react in any way, although some of his soldiers couldn't help but cry out. Perhaps he couldn't kill everyone who was there, but at least he could have dealt with the Lord and then run away with her. Jin insisted that this was all untrue, and the lizard was wounded and exhausted. And the Lord remembered how he first saw the power of the Chosen One when he was in the lizard tribe. It was obvious that the Chosen One was there to force him to make a certain decision. If he did not name a successor, after his death the people were to choose a lord themselves. But Ken still, and in that case, was going to seize power. And before that, she would have enlisted the support of the lizards to clear the city. After this, the Lord fell into deep thought and his son began to swear. In the end, the current Lord no longer had a choice. So he didn't argue and appointed Ken as his heir. Word of the change of Lord Automation spread throughout the city in an instant. Humans and other races began to trade more with each other, and the atmosphere changed. Even the great families remained silent and accepted the changes that came. The only one who still couldn't accept it was Zhang. While his sister took over power from their father, he watched from the sidelines. However, nothing happened, so he decided to leave the automation. He had no intention of leaving forever, but only to gather strength. The lizard that appeared in the stable had no intention of stopping him. But Zhang still spoke rudely to him before saddling his horse and riding away. As soon as his back disappeared, the lizard took one of the torches and gave a signal. And as soon as Zhang passed through the gate outside, a goblin pounced on him. With one swift movement, the goblin cut off the man's head and went away. After everything that happened, Hegemony had to accept defeat. Eventually, he left and led the hyena tribe west, clearing out territories behind him. This loss didn't seem to affect him much, and he took it better than the previous ones. Now Songwon could expand his influence in the vacated positions. These lands included coastal areas, the southern and northern parts of the peninsula, but in the end, Songwon decided to leave it for later and do more important things. After Ken became the master of automation, she had an unusual dream. In a dream, he came to the god of beetles to convey his message. However, noticing him, the girl bowed and began to express her gratitude to him. It was all she could do, as she was just beginning her path as a lord. Songwon didn't answer, but only showed her the piece of iron they used in the deals. But Ken still didn't understand what it meant or what God wanted. Then she felt a touch and turned her attention to the lizard behind her. She already wanted to tell him that she had dreamed of God, but she didn't have time, because the next moment she woke up, falling from the chair and hitting her back painfully. At first, she decided that she had just had another stupid dream, like all the others. However, over time, Hui Kyung realized the opposite, that it was a prophecy. While pondering the meaning of the prophecy, she reached the shop where the transaction was taking place. The troll merchant was going to buy the quality silk that the lizard was selling. The troll offered to give a bag of iron in exchange for all his silk. The lizard quickly agreed and was about to make a deal, but they were interrupted by Ken. And then she explained in a friendly manner that the lizard was going to deal with her first. The silk merchant was confused, not understanding what was happening. Then the troll did not interfere with them, and disappointed went to another place. As soon as this happened, Ken began to scold the lizard for his low prices. Considering that the lizard goods were rare, the price for them must have been high. Having finished with this, she also showed the scales that allow one to measure the weight of the metal. When they measured the hardware of the troll and the automation, the former was lighter. So she taught the lizard that the weight of metal can vary. Just at that moment, Rak approached her and asked her to weigh his iron. This piece was different from all the others because it was from ancient ruins. However, it was so hard that the tribe's blacksmiths could not melt it down. So Rak asked that automation try to turn him into a weapon. It was then that Ken realized that this was the task given to her by God. Then she immediately agreed, but over time she realized that it was very difficult. Even her, but the blacksmith could not cope with the metal, despite the fact that he promised the opposite. The strangest thing about this iron was that it was difficult to shape. The blacksmith beat at it for half a day and could barely make one spear point. One way or another, he was not going to repeat this experience, not only because he himself was tired. This also required a lot of resources, and the end would not justify the means. The lizard suggested telling the leader everything honestly and not racking his brains. But for Ken, this was not an option, as it would destroy her pride. So, deciding to try a different tactic, she headed towards the interior of the palace. There they met a mud soldier with the lizard, who were made in this part of the palace. They were used to restore automation, but they could not be controlled. But she didn't want to show them what was behind the door right in front of them. There was a source of automation, a huge wheel driven by a stream of water. Thus, water and the wheel provided enormous power without interruption. In fact, people didn't know how exactly automation uses this power. But the girl was going to use it for more than just forging iron. She was going to use it to change the automation, and she enlisted the help of the lizard for this. Later, she began to design a mechanism that would help bring her plans to life. She was assisted in this by Zaol, who was a technical specialist. The only downside was that it would have required a lot of money to build. And the problem was not so much that there wouldn't be enough money, but rather that it might not pay off. This is what made Ken doubt his decision. One night, she even asked her demon if he could know the future. But to her disappointment, he could only predict what he saw before his eyes. Then the girl told him about her plan and the future she imagined. She intended to leave the first water wheel empty for the next lords to use. The second would be connected to the furnace in the forge to blow air. The third wheel was to be connected to a hammer that would beat the iron. And the fourth was to turn the millstone to grind more grain. But even so, the demon could not foresee such a future. However, the plan was a good one, and he admitted it. And since Ken also thought it was a good idea, she decided to go ahead with it. First of all, she started by constructing a watermill. But during the construction, many difficulties and major incidents arose. And the most painful thing was the encounter with the trial and error method. They could not build a fourth wheel. 3 wheels was the maximum. After all, to make 4 wheels, you would have to start from scratch again. Many families were against this, as it would have doubled the time it would have taken to complete the work. However, Ken was adamant in her decision to build exactly 4 wheels. As a deterrent, she told her people that they must do the will of the insect god. None of them wanted to incur the automation's wrath, so they didn't argue. And the girl once again promised that she would keep her word to God and build 4 wheels. However, Song-Woon clearly remembered that he did not ask to build exactly 4 wheels. But that's why he chose the human race as the second one. They were always goal-oriented. Although the construction period was extended, other families did not oppose it. The main reason was that they could also benefit from it. Thanks to all this construction, trade also grew. Eventually, after a difficult journey, the 4-wheeled watermill was built. Despite its enormous size, it worked properly and pumped water. And now automation occupied the first place in the world in terms of technological development. After that, the system informed Song-Woon that his skills had been upgraded. Now they could produce durable, high-quality iron products. Besides this, the first currency and the first prayer were also created on the third continent. All these skills allowed Sung-Woon to be ahead of other players in development. After some time, elves arrived in the city and were amazed by the capabilities of the mill. They arrived there to conduct trade and immediately came across a silk merchant. And then they tried to deceive the merchant by providing him with what they said was good quality iron. However, the merchant quickly discovered the deception as soon as he weighed the piece. He refused to sell them silk because they would not accept low-quality iron. Then the elves became furious and began to scold and insult his work. The merchant could not stand this, and cursing them, drove them away from his counter. Ken watched the entire scene from behind cover, trying not to give away her location. The silk merchant had improved his trading skills greatly since she had last seen him, but she was even more amazed by the elves, since they did not often go there. That's why she decided to follow them to understand how they conduct trade. And after a few hours of surveillance, it became clear that these guys only do business with naive people. They were always trying to cheat someone and were more like swindlers than traders. So Kian couldn't turn a blind eye to it. Meanwhile, another player sent a chat request to Song-Woon. He was obviously the god of those elves, but it was not clear what he wanted. The Elven forces were far to the north, so everything became more confusing. And besides, he didn't have much information about those places. So he accepted the request for a conversation, hoping that it would be productive. At that very moment, an elf called Eldar appeared and greeted him. A few of his phrases were enough for Sun-Woon to determine that he was a role player. Such players chose a role for themselves and immersed themselves in it, playing out their character. This type of player was not uncommon, and Seong-Woon had no ill will towards them. And so he greeted his interlocutor in a friendly manner and asked what he needed. And he in turn noted that he was much friendlier than Hegemony. The elf was familiar with him only because he personally drove his army from the northern coast. And he turned to Song-Woon to demand tribute from him in exchange for peace. He did not respond to his impudent request and immediately added him to the blacklist. It was too dangerous to conduct reconnaissance, and it was also impossible to send insects. He knew nothing about his opponent, but his opponent knew nothing about him. But the fact that he managed to drive out hegemony spoke volumes about his abilities. So, Song-Woon began to prepare for war and check the other players in advance. The next day, dressed appropriately for a lord, Kyon went to meet the elves. The elves were not lacking in intelligence and therefore quickly recognized her identity. The leader of the Elven group immediately greeted her and introduced himself. He understood that she had come to sort out the deals they had made. The elves thought about this in advance and prepared an item found in the ruins as a gift. They gave it as a bribe in exchange for her turning a blind eye to their trading methods. However, the girl did not accept it since she already had a lot of money. Then the elf tried to find out how much she needed to pay for such a service. Ken had no intention of accepting any bribes in exchange for good relations. All they needed to have a good relationship with her was to follow the rules. She even ended up making them buy figurines of the bug god creature. She argued that this was how they would pay for the damages caused. After some time, the elf Hassadian, who was the leader, asked her for an apology. In his opinion, she insulted the elves and demanded that they change their faith. But this was complete absurdity. She didn't demand anything like that from them. However, she had no intention of meeting the envoy even if he came again. That is why the lizard promised that he would prepare even more insults for them. Ken gave him her permission and told him to prepare for war too. After some time, the elven troops reached the walls of automation. They walked led by their leader, who did not expect that automation would be so small. From the outside, everything seemed very unprotected, so he immediately gave the order to attack. Eldar, the dancing god of shadows, turned his gaze to the ground, to the elves who believed in him. There were 300 warriors, and they were enough to capture the automation. Although the walls were high, they were made of clay, and there were not many warriors there. Besides, their weapons were not as good as those of the elves. Therefore, the leader was already preparing to bring the Lord of Automation, who was objectionable to him, to his knees. Song-Woon also expected this development and was already prepared for battle. Suddenly, the leader was informed that a camp of automation soldiers had been discovered. He was in a gorge, and more than 70 warriors were waiting for them there. There were so few of them only because the lizard troops were also located behind the elves. So the elves found themselves surrounded with no way to escape or maneuver. Eldar did not expect that elves and people would be on the same side. Such a development of events frightened him, and he began to accuse Song-Woon of finding an ally among the players. However, in the list of players in this place, besides Eldar himself, there was still one player. This also confused him because he thought that Song-Woon was a god only for humans. Song-Woon confirmed his guess, but noted that in addition to this, he was also the god of lizards. Meanwhile, the elves on the battlefield began to panic even before they entered the battle. They tried to prepare to defend themselves from attacks from two sides. But suddenly more people appeared at the top of the gorge, pointing weapons at them. The situation became even more difficult as the elves were unable to dodge the hail of arrows. It was at that moment that the lizards reached them. Even so, the elves still tried to rise up to defend themselves from the attack. However, it was impossible to fight against the magicians walking ahead, so they were defeated before they could do anything. This fight was less like a fight and more like a massacre where the victims were elves. The elves who were lucky enough to survive instead of fighting began to run. They did not respond to their leader's calls to stop, worrying only about their own lives. The lizards noticed the loss of morale of their enemies and decided to finish their respect quickly. Their commander shared this opinion, so he sent them on a second attack. But unlike the previous one, this time he ordered everyone to be destroyed. In the end, Eldar could only accept his defeat. He had no intention of interfering, and now he just wanted to know what Song-Woon wanted. He asked for information, technology, and resources, and that was not all. He wanted Eldar to stay with him, as it would be difficult for him to survive alone now. Eldar himself did not answer and began to think about this proposal. His position after the loss was truly unenviable. This time he lost almost all of his warriors and now could not resist anyone. But on the other hand, his opponent had two races and could protect him if necessary. Sun-Woon thought that Eldar would rather refuse these demands than accept them. However, he did exactly the opposite and still accepted the offer. He promised to pass on everything necessary both in the present and in the future. And to prove the sincerity of his intentions, he immediately began with a story about the North. Thus, Sun-Woon learned that the Eldar had allies in the North. There were two players besides him who were also in the North. Together they formed a secret alliance without any systemic support. One of them, Solongos, played the rare race of centaurs and was a formidable opponent. This race were cavalrymen, and their numbers were difficult to increase. There was also Chun-Sik, a Korean player who had the ogre race. Although this race had low intelligence, he managed to increase it through blessings. He managed to develop a good civilization only on a small territory. And although Chun-Sik should have been the strongest, he was not the one fighting hegemony for territory. However, he joined the alliance when it was necessary to drive the impostor from their lands. So technically, it turned out that he was fighting 1 against 3, and therefore he went south. After this, Chun-Sik began to ask Eldar for a huge tribute without any reason. And so, as soon as Eldar himself contacted Sun Wun, he asked for tribute. But in the end, Chun-Sik would have taken over the elves' territory because they were weak. But Song Wun himself did not need a huge power to appear in the north. So he teamed up with Eldar to help each other solve this problem. However, he saw no point in this since he had already lost his troops and the priest. All he had left was a small territory, but it wasn't of much use. The interlocutor reminded him that initially he was supposed to receive a small area of art. This is exactly what could help in their plan, which he had already come up with. Meanwhile, in the north, a tribe of centaurs was given a new prophecy. It said that a king would soon come to those lands. This king will disrupt the usual order of things and subjugate those who live there. The king had the meaning of someone to whom everyone bowed, but he was not a god, because the gods were in heaven and he was on earth. The leader of the centaurs believed that he would be this king. However, the prophet quickly dispelled his dreams, saying that this was not so. These were, and not the same lizards about which there were many rumors. Although they were strong, the forces in the north were much more powerful than them. The prophecy said that the king would be a giant standing on 2 legs. Then the chieftain guessed that they were talking about the ogre priest, and the prophet confirmed this. Tamarid was angry at the very thought of having to submit to such a king, and so having accused the prophet of lying, he dealt with him with 1 blow, and then he swore that he would not bow his head to anyone except God. This was Song Wun's plan to cause discord between the ogre and centaur tribes. However, there was still a chance that Chief Tamarid might not believe the prophecy, but in that case, Song Wun was going to put it into practice and see where it led. Ever since everything happened, the centaur had the same dream every night. To become king, he had to climb the mountain, but he couldn't do it. He tried and tried until he woke up, and so on in a circle. To get rid of this obsession in reality, he needed to become a king. However, this was difficult to do since few people had heard of him. But suddenly other changes began to happen. An elf prophet came to him again from the same tribe as his predecessor. He asked if he had heard about the prophecy about the ogre king. And then he told that it was possible to avoid that prophecy and the throne should be taken by a centaur. After him, a man from automation arrived and presented tribute. And finally, the last one to visit him was the lizard. The centaur was so used to everyone calling him king that he thought he would do the same. However, unlike the others, the lizard came to tell him to give up this idea. After these words, the centaur completely stopped understanding anything. The humans and elves found him suitable, and he was interested in the opinions of the lizards. Rekrak might have admitted the same, or he might not have. In any case, the lizard himself believed that it was better for him not to become king, because even if he became one, his god might not recognize it. This assumption immediately knocked the centaur's arrogance down a notch. He hadn't thought about it. And the lizard continued to add fuel to the fire, starting to talk about the hierarchy of gods, and about the fact that most likely the god of the centaurs was subordinate to the god of the ogres. It was hard to believe, and the centaur could no longer restrain himself. And so, accusing the lizard of blasphemy, he attacked him. However, he advised him to be angry not at him, but at the one who oppressed both him and his god. There could be truth in these words, for his dream was a negative revelation, and perhaps God did not send him positive revelations on purpose. The lizard advised him to go against God in some moments. Having sent Owen away, Tamaridu began to prepare for battle. After all, he decided to go against God and become king anyway. Thus, Rakrak's plan to sow discord between the races worked. Even the elf himself didn't know that he was capable of such a thing if he wanted to. But now he had to do the same with the gods, and here he began to have doubts. If the going got tough, Solongos might let his friends swallow him up. That's why there was a high probability that he wouldn't put up much of a fight against what was happening. In a place hidden from the sight of mortals, a conversation between 2 gods unfolded. Solongos was dressed in iron armor, reminiscent of the armor of ancient warriors. He apologized to Chun-Sik for failing to stop his subordinate. He in turn also asked for forgiveness, since he did not help enough with hegemony. Soon the 2 priests were to fight, and Chun-Sik was sure that Tamarid would die. However, Songolos, on the contrary, was confident that he would emerge victorious, and his friend's cold confidence in his victory could not help but irritate him. Tamaridu gathered the tribes under his control for battle and rushed into the attack. Driven by bloodlust, he and his warriors charged into the goblin line and entered the fray. The leader of the centaurs did not notice until the very end that he had fallen into the trap of the leader of the ogres. Until the ogres jumped out at them, who had anticipated this development. The stunned centaurs tried to evade the ogre's attack. However, their legs were already entangled in the bodies of the dead goblins and they were unable to escape. The ogres armed with hammers and clubs attacked them, smashing their heads. Only Tamarid continued to fight, not paying attention to anything. He managed to easily cut off the heads of 2 ogres who had killed his men. Now there was only one person left on his path, the one he had come for, the leader of the ogres. Both of them were going to win, so they grabbed their weapons and started fighting. After colliding once, their weapons fell to the ground. After this, the leaders of the 2 tribes continued to fight with their bare hands. Eventually, the ogre grabbed Tamaris by the neck. The centaur tried with all his might to free himself, but it was all in vain. His neck was broken pretty quickly anyway, and he was thrown around like a doll. So, the ogre emerged victorious from this battle, and rumors about it quickly spread. The gods who started all this mess were watching all this. Elder was even surprised by this outcome because he really thought that the centaurs would win, and Sung Woon scrolled up and down the system window, still remaining silent. When asked if his lizards were resistant to the cold, he replied that he would not send them there. However, he already had a plan ready that would require Eldar. Even though he wasn't ranked high, he was still strong. After confirming that he was still cooperating with him, Song Woon returned to his work and left unanswered questions about what this was all about. Meanwhile, Chun Song studied the characteristics of Nebula that the system provided. He had known this nickname for a long time since that guy was first in the ranking. Now he was unlucky enough to run into him, but still the advantage was on Yoongseok's side. This is all because lizards and people were not resistant to the cold. Besides, he had prepared perfectly and now he was waiting for him to attack him before winter. However, time passed. Winter was approaching, but there was no trace of his race's presence. And when the Elven settlement started burning, everything became even more confused. However, Chun Seok had enough time to figure out what kind of tactics the enemy was using. It was a scorched earth tactic to weaken the enemy through supply. This tactic was usually not used at the beginning of a fight because it did not work that way. But this time, the enemy put himself in a difficult position from the start. When the war started, he would want to plunder or trade for supplies. Without supplies, the ogres would quickly begin to starve. Chun Sik was very wrong when he thought that Song Woon would be weaker in this battle. And now all he could do was sit and watch as his ogres failed to survive the winter. The plan worked, and soon the ogres ran out of food. Then they began to raid goblin villages and devour them. But even this was not enough. This food source also quickly ran out. Many of the ogres had already died of hunger, but Song Woon was in no hurry to appear. Eventually, the starving ogres began to move south into the wastelands. It was no longer possible to hold out, so Chun Sik turned to an ally. He wanted them to unite and attack Song Woon together. However, I didn't expect him to say that he no longer had troops. This happened because the Black Lizard tribe attacked while he was weakened. But he still intended to contact Chung Sik after receiving an offer from Eldar. He wanted him to join Song Woon as well and save his life. However, Solongos refused him because he did not want to end up in the same situation as him, and he decided that it would be better to join someone he had known for a long time. He still had 10 warriors left, so he could fight one battle, and then, without wasting time, both gods began to plan the upcoming battle. They threw all their efforts into destroying the main forces of the enemy. They didn't have to wait long for the lizards. They appeared on the battlefield quickly. To gain a better chance, the gods of the north united with their subjects spiritually, and then the 2 of them attacked Rak with full confidence that they would defeat him. However, the battle ended completely differently than they expected. They only managed to land one attack before the lizard easily defeated them. Thus, both gods became prisoners in the hands of Song Woon. Now he could control their fate and even kill them if he wanted. But for now, he left everything as it was and decided to sort it out later. Despite defeating 2 gods, his level did not increase. But he got the opportunity to randomly receive 2 small areas. This time he got just what he needed, birds and swamps. So he could try to exchange the blessings of the bug god between his 2 races. But the new blessings would still begin to apply from the next generation. So Song Woon left the decision on this issue for later. Now that he had dealt with 3 players, he could assess the situation in the world. From the west, a swarm of locusts brought him information that 5 players were fighting there. They united into 3 alliances, but were not dangerous until they got close to him. To the east was the sea, and it was unimportant as long as there were still lands. The south and north should already be almost under the complete control of Song Woon himself. However, one god could not be in 2 places. Therefore, he decided to use the elves in the north and give them to the Eldar. All this time, the elves who had to leave their home were moving deeper into the north. But this could not continue for long as the situation became more difficult. They had not received any news from their god for a very long time, so they did not know what to do. However, recently the leader finally received a revelation from God. It said that there were those who would help their tribe, and they would come from the south. At that very moment, a messenger came to the chieftain's tent to report the approach of the people. So they could only hope that these would be the people from the revelation. All the important people of the tribe came out to greet. To their surprise, the leader of the arriving people turned out to be the Lord of Automation. However, they needed all the help they could get, so they did not show any discontent. Having greeted them in a friendly manner, the elves offered to go with them. But before the girl entered the tent, the lizard checked her. Ken arrived there to help the elves on the orders of her god. Therefore, they brought weapons and household tools with them. However, she was not going to help just like that and expected payment for it. The leader of the elves began to claim that he could not pay because of their deplorable condition. He hoped that he would be able to get help just like that, but nothing happened. The girl was adamant in her intention to receive payment, and I wasn't going to coddle them if they had nothing to give in return. As soon as the elf realized this, he offered her an exchange not for things, but for something else. Taking out a map, he showed where the iron mine was located. He also noted that the soil there was fertile and the grain was growing well. Thus, he was prepared for an unequal exchange that would allow them to survive. Naturally, under normal conditions, the price of such a place was much higher than what they were offered. But they had nothing to complain about since this was their only chance. Fortunately, the girl was not against such an exchange, but on the contrary, was only for it. That's why she immediately took out a document that would confirm the conclusion of the deal. After that, they both put their fingerprints on this document. Thus, the negotiations were successful and the deal came into force. It was the first credit transaction in this world, and the system reported it. All the changes indicated that the world had expanded and was no longer simple. The races learned to trade with each other, and thanks to this, they developed faster. Now all that was left for Songwoon to do was figure out how to control this expanded world. Sometime later, the lizards dealt with the last tribes that threatened them. Now there was only the ocean ahead, and it was unknown what to do next. They succeeded in completely conquering the south, and this peninsula became the complete property of their god. And it was necessary to decide how exactly to rule these lands so that everything would not fall apart. There have been a great many systems of government, and they have had many shortcomings. Songwoon was about to make a choice between feudalism and monarchy. In the first case, the king would grant lands to the lords and they would rule over them, and in the second case, royal officials would be in charge of everything. And he was leaning towards the second option since it was the most suitable. The next day, Rakrak gathered his subordinates and told them that he had a dream. In this dream, he saw lands and villages that they united with their own strength. So in order to expand their holdings, they had to move further. Rakrak drew a map, and we, together with the others, began to study the lands that were depicted. It took some time, but eventually they reached a land whose name no one knew. No one even lived there because it was too dangerous. However, there was one lizard who knew this place, although he did not know its name. After describing the place, Rakrak confirmed that everything was correct. He saw this land in a dream and knew that it was called Orazon, the land where God stands. And following his will, he was going to become the king of Orazon. The lizards prepared for the campaign, which meant that now the most interesting part had begun. Rakrak was already known, and his power was reckoned with. But there were still those who were ready to fight back. The creation of the state had already begun, and Orazon was to become its capital. Since it was a monarchy, the administration had to be sent from the capital. And most importantly, uniform rules were in effect throughout the entire land, and compliance with them was monitored. At the same time, the Elven village and automation were more likened to feudalism. Despite the fact that each had its own leader, one lizard was assigned to each of the leaders. At the same time, both retained their status as supreme ruler and leader for the race. So far, all this has been enough for the country to begin to develop. Songwoon used two options at once and combined feudalism and monarchy. And the Eldar race also became part of his kingdom, since they were located on his lands.